Tonight, my sleepy heads, we're exploring the remarkable moment when Pope Leo I did the impossible and stood before Attila the Hun and saved the city of Rome. In an era of fear and invasion, Leo's courage and diplomacy became a turning point in history. This is the story of faith, leadership, and the day a pope faced down a warlord to preserve civilization. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. To ensure a peaceful rest, please dim your lights to a minimum, turn on your fan to create the perfect noise, and let's commence this fantastic story. In the waning days of Rome's glory, a young deacon named Leo quietly ascended to prominence. The Western Empire was in danger of disintegrating in the year 440. Instead of looking to senators or generals for advice, imperial officials looked to a churchman. At Emperor Valentinian III's behest, Leo journeyed to Gaul to mediate a bitter feud between General Aetius, Rome's most powerful commander, and the magistrate Albinus. The emperor's decision to entrust this delicate mission to Leo was significant, as the able deacon had established a reputation for prudence and authority beyond ecclesiastical circles. While Leo negotiated peace in Gaul, fate intervened back home. Pope Sixtus III died in Leo's absence, and on September the 29th, 440, the clergy and people of Rome unanimously elected Leo as Bishop of Rome. The news reached him up north. The mediator would now become the supreme pastor of the Western Church. Leo returned to a city in need of strong leadership. Stepping into the role of Bishop of Rome, later generations would hail him as Pope Leo the Great. He carried both humility and resolve. Rome in the 440s was a city of contrasts, still adorned with imperial marble and Christian basilicas, yet teeming with destitute refugees from barbarian invasions. Leo threw himself into the work. From the pulpit he preached not only doctrine but also charity. He organized relief for those suffering from famine and war, urging the faithful to practice mercy and almsgiving alongside their fasts. Under his guidance, the church opened its granaries to feed the hungry and its monasteries to shelter the homeless. Leo's compassion in action earned him a fatherly status among Romans. In a world where emperors taxed and generals fought, it was the Bishop of Rome who cared for the widow and orphan. However, Leo was not a passive individual. He was equally a man of ideas and unwavering determination. As heresies sprouted amid the turmoil of the times, Leo responded with intellectual rigor and firm discipline. When news came that certain priests in distant Aquileia were tolerating the Pelagian heresy, Leo swiftly ordered a synod to correct them. In Rome, he discovered a secret sect of Manichaean dualists lurking in the shadows, likely refugees from the recently fallen African provinces. The Pope reacted decisively. He investigated, preached fiery sermons against their false light, and, according to his contemporary Prosper of Aquitaine, even burned their forbidden books. By 444 he declared the capital cleansed of the Manichaean contagion. Such actions might seem harsh to modern eyes, but to Leo's mind the very soul of Rome was at stake. If the empire was crumbling, at least the faith must stand firm. Leo's blend of compassion and authority extended his influence beyond the usual spiritual realm. The Western imperial court itself acknowledged his leadership. In June 445, Emperor Valentinian III issued a remarkable decree recognizing the primacy of the Bishop of Rome based on the merits of Peter and the dignity of the ancient capital. Provincial governors were even ordered to enforce papal summonses, a legal nod to Leo's supremacy over Western Christendom. This feat was unprecedented. Once merely primus inter pares, first among equals of bishops, the Bishop of Rome now held a recognized preeminence. Under Leo's stewardship, the very title of Pope, once used broadly for any bishop, became reserved exclusively for Rome's bishop. The decline of the empire was sowing the seeds of the papacy's future grandeur. Despite these accolades, Leo remained at heart a pastor. He corresponded with distant churches, arbitrating disputes in Gaul and Spain as a trusted father figure. He drew around him learned men like Prosper to assist in administration and correspondence. Ever mindful of his exemplar, St. Peter the Apostle, Leo championed the idea that the Pope is Peter's heir, carrying the keys of spiritual authority. The ultimate test of this conviction was imminent. As the mid-5th century approached, ominous tidings spread across the Alps. A storm was gathering in the north. The Huns, led by a warlord whose name was already spoken in dread whispers, were on the move. Unbeknownst to Leo, destiny was steering him toward a singular role, not only as a teacher and shepherd of souls, but as Rome's protector in its darkest hour. The stage was set for an encounter that would resound through the ages, and the humble deacon-turned-pope would soon be called upon to save an empire. Pope Leo I was solidifying his spiritual authority while the Western Roman Empire around him was on the verge of collapse. By the mid-5th century, Rome's dominion had shrunk to a pathetic core. Little more than Italy and part of Gaul, observers noted, of the Western realm. The grandeur of Caesar and Augustus was now a ghost haunting crumbling walls. Gone were the rich provinces of North Africa. The Vandals had seized Carthage in 439, cutting off Rome's critical grain supply. Hispania and Gaul were carved up by Visigothic and Burgundian kings who paid only token respect to the emperor. Across the sea, Britannia, once a Roman diocese, was abandoned to wild Anglo-Saxon warlords. The Western Empire in Leo's time was essentially an Italian kingdom struggling to survive, its frontiers pressed on all sides by so-called barbarians, and its treasury drained. The city of Rome itself, though still symbolically powerful, was a mere shadow of its former self. The imperial court had long since relocated to Ravenna, a marsh-girt city easier to defend. In Rome, ancient monuments decayed even as new churches rose. The populace, much diminished from a century ago, lived in uneasy suspense. Memories of the Visigoth sack of 410 still lingered like a national trauma. Elderly Romans could recall the horror when Alaric's Goths breached the walls and looted the Eternal City for 3 days. The psychological scar had not healed. Now, 4 decades later, rumours spread that an even fiercer enemy was approaching Italy's borders. Children heard frightening tales of the Hun with his ruthless horsemen and felt their parents' anxiety. Many asked, was history repeating itself? Or worse, was this the end of Rome at last? In the palaces of Ravenna, Emperor Valentinian III reigned in name, but real power was precariously balanced. The true strongman was Flavius Aetius, the Magister Militum, master of soldiers. Famed for both his cunning and his controversial alliances, Aetius had spent his youth as a hostage among the Huns, even befriending their leaders. Hardened by that experience, he knew Rome could not fight all its enemies at once. With grim pragmatism, Aetius had struck deals with some barbarians to fight others. In 437 he formed an alliance with Attila's Huns to demolish the Burgundian kingdom in Gaul, eradicating it from its core. Western Rome was forced to play a desperate game of divide et impera in order to survive. By the late 440s, Aetius managed a fragile coalition holding Gaul against the Visigoths and Italy against the Ostrogoths. But the Huns, once his occasional allies, were becoming an ever greater threat. Aetius knew Attila's character too well. The Hun king's ambitions had no limit. The cultural fabric of the empire was also fraying. The old pagan aristocracy had mostly bowed to Christianity, but not always sincerely. Some clung to classical traditions and nostalgic dreams of Rome's past, while the new reality, a Christian empire fighting for its life, demanded a different ethos. In this atmosphere, spiritual interpretations of Rome's misfortune flourished. Many Christian Romans, Leo among them, viewed the successive calamities as divine chastisement for the empire's sins. Was God using barbarian invaders as a scourge to humble Rome? The question was pondered in sermons and letters. Decades earlier, St. Augustine had written The City of God after the 410 sack, explaining that earthly empires rise and fall while the City of God endures. Now Augustine was gone. He had died in 430 as Vandals besieged his city of Hippo, but his ideas lived on. Pope Leo, steeped in such theology, urged his flock not to lose faith. If the empire was crumbling, perhaps it was all the more urgent to uphold Christian virtue and unity. By 450, the Western court was rife with intrigue and insecurity. Emperor Valentinian, never a strong ruler, was dominated first by his formidable mother, Galla Placidia, and then by Aetius. With Placidia's death in 450 and the emperor's own sister Honoria embroiled in scandal, she had secretly appealed to Attila for help escaping an arranged marriage, offering him her hand, and half the empire as dowry. The dynasty itself seemed to teeter. When reports came that Attila had considered Honoria's plea and was mustering his forces, panic swept the Italian elite. Attila's reputation as the scourge of God preceded him. He had already bullied the Eastern Empire into paying enormous tribute, and now he cast his covetous gaze westward. In the spring of 451, Attila marched into Gaul. The showdown came on the Catalaunian plains near Chalons. There, Aetius, joined by Roman troops and various Foederati allies, Visigoths, Franks, confronted the Huns in one of antiquity's great battles. The fight was brutal and indecisive. Attila's advance was halted, but not decisively crushed. Corpses littered the plain, and the Visigothic king was slain in the fray. But Attila lived to fight another day. The Battle of Chalons, instead of a clear Roman victory, resulted in a Pyrrhic stalemate that left the Hunnic horde battered yet intact. Gaul had taken the brunt of Attila's wrath, giving Italy a moment of relief, but the respite was fleeting. Late in 451, as winter fell, unsettling news reached Rome. Attila had regrouped his forces beyond the Alps. The Hun was far from finished. In fact, he was enraged. They had thwarted his campaign in Gaul, leaving his appetite for conquest unsated. Honoria's offer still stood as a convenient pretext. In Attila's mind, the dowry he demanded, half of the Western Empire, remained unpaid. Early the next year, scouts and refugees brought terrifying reports. Attila was crossing into Italy. City after city in the northern provinces was falling to fire and sword. The spectre that had loomed so long was now at hand. Rome's darkest hour was approaching, even as its secular might was at its weakest. The people's hopes increasingly turned to prayer, and to the unassuming figure of Pope Leo, whose courage and faith would soon be tested as never before. In the gathering gloom of the 450s, Pope Leo I emerged as more than a religious leader. He became the soul of a dying empire. While legions faltered and emperors dithered, Leo provided a different kind of strength, one rooted in faith and moral conviction. He often preached that earthly turmoils were transient, but the spiritual battle for righteousness was eternal. Leo's unwavering faith in the unique function of his position fueled his confidence. As Bishop of Rome, he saw himself as heir to St. Peter, the Apostle Christ had charged with feeding his sheep. To Leo, the task was no mere honorific. It was a living mandate. In one letter he wrote, "To deny the authority of the chair of Peter is to question the very foundation of the Church." He strove to live up to that high calling, convinced that in his leadership the voice of the apostles echoed anew. This conviction was dramatically vindicated in 451 at the Great Council of Chalcedon, a church synod convened far to the east in Asia Minor to settle a theological crisis. Leo could not attend in person, troubles in the west kept him in Rome, but he sent legates bearing a document he authored, the famous Tome of Leo. This tome clearly defined the dual nature of Christ, both fully God and fully man, and was intended to guide the Council Fathers out of contentious debate. As the assembly of bishops read Leo's words aloud, a sudden unity swept the hall. According to the council records, the bishops cried out in unison, "This is the faith of the fathers. Peter has spoken thus through Leo." In that acclamation, Leo's authority was affirmed in an almost mystical way. It was as if St. Peter himself had stood among them, teaching through Leo's voice. The Roman Pope's stature soared. He was now revered as Leo the Great, a pillar of orthodoxy and a figure of international renown. For Leo personally, it was confirmation that his leadership carried not just human approval, but divine sanction. Back in Rome, Leo leveraged this moral authority to bolster the city's resolve. He preached frequently to his flock, tailoring his message to the tumultuous times. In homilies, he called the invasion threats a test of faith. Drawing on scripture, he likened Rome to the biblical Nineveh, a mighty city that could be spared from destruction if its people repented and turned to God. He urged public fasting and prayer vigils, and it was said that the churches were filled day and night with supplicants crying for deliverance. The Pope himself led processions through the streets, venerating relics of saints and imploring heavenly aid to avert the scourge approaching Italy. To a population frightened by news of flaming towns in the north, Leo's calm and resolute presence was a godsend. He told them, God did not abandon Jonah's Nineveh, nor will he abandon Rome, seat of his apostles. Such words gave hope to the hopeless. Leo's influence extended even into the imperial palace. When Emperor Valentinian III and his court vacillated on how to deal with Attila's impending onslaught, Leo did not hesitate to offer counsel. Some accounts suggest it was Leo who volunteered to personally meet the Hun, a proposal that stunned the imperial advisors. Others say the idea originated from the emperor, who realized that no general or diplomat had the gravitas to face Attila on equal terms, whereas the saintly bishop of Rome just might. Regardless, by the beginning of 452, everyone's attention was focused on Leo, possibly the sole individual capable of saving Rome from the abyss. It was a heavy burden for a man of the cloth, yet Leo prepared to shoulder it with the same sense of duty that had guided him all along. There was a profound symbolism in Leo's stepping forward. Here was a representative of spiritual authority confronting the might of worldly violence. The clash was not simply between a pope and a warlord, but between two world-views, one of faith, mercy and moral suasion, and another of conquest, fear and raw power. Leo understood this. In quiet moments of prayer before his departure, he surely reflected on the trials of past leaders of the Church. He prayed at the tomb of St. Peter in the Vatican Basilica, seeking courage. Tradition holds that Leo had a vision there, hearing the words, "Peace be with you, I am with you," as if spoken by Peter or an angel. Empowered by this reassurance, Leo arose determined to act. If Attila was indeed a scourge sent as punishment, then Leo would be the intercessor pleading for mercy on Rome's behalf, the new Moses before the Pharaoh, or a David against Goliath armed only with faith. By the spring of 452, Attila's forces had stormed into northern Italy, and panic gripped the land. Emperor Valentinian remained safely behind Ravenna's walls, and General Aetius, lacking an army strong enough after the Gaulish campaign, could do little. It was in this vacuum of secular leadership that Leo's moment arrived. The Pope gathered a small delegation to accompany him, among them the former consul Gennadius Avienus and the ex-prefect Memmius Trigetius, distinguished Romans who lent political weight to the embassy. But there was no question who led it. Dressed not in armour, but in simple clerical robes, Leo set out northward, determined to confront the unconfrontable. As he left the gates of Rome, citizens wept and cheered him in equal measure, praying for his success, fearing for his safety. Behind him trailed an austere retinue of priests and deacons carrying holy relics and perhaps gifts for the Hun king. It was an unprecedented sight. The vicar of Christ riding forth to meet the terror of the world. The sun-baked Italian roads ahead were uncertain, but Leo's purpose was clear. In his heart burned both the courage of a lion and the compassion of a shepherd. Whatever happened on this journey, Rome's fate and Leo's legacy would forever be intertwined on that fateful day when faith stood face to face with fury. While Leo advanced north, Attila the Hun drove his war host relentlessly south. To understand the collision course of these two figures, one must step into Attila's world, a world of vast open. The vast steppes echoed with thundering hooves, symbolizing a destiny forged in blood and superstition. Attila was no ordinary barbarian chieftain. He styled himself as something far grander, even cosmic. A legend circulated among his people that a sacred weapon had fallen into Attila's hands, the Sword of Mars. A humble shepherd, the story went, discovered an ornate sword in a field, revealed by the blood of a limping heifer. He presented it to Attila, who exulted in the find. Believing it a gift from the war god, whom Romans identified as Mars, Attila took it as a sign of divine favour. He thought he had been appointed ruler of the whole world, and that through the sword of Mars supremacy in all wars was assured to him. So writes the historian Jordanes, echoing the accounts of Attila's contemporaries. Armed with this talisman and unshakable self-confidence, Attila saw himself as an instrument of godly wrath, a scourge sent upon the earth. Indeed, later Romans would call him flagellum Dei, the scourge of God, believing that he was a punishment for the sins of humankind. Under Attila's command, the Hunnic Empire reached its zenith. From the plains of Hungary across the Danube and into Germany, he united a confederation of Huns, Alans, Ostrogoths, and other tribes through charisma and fear. He became sole ruler in 445 after allegedly murdering his brother Bleda, an act that removed the last check on his power. Ruthless as he was, Attila was also a shrewd strategist. He realized that brute force alone wouldn't sustain his dominion. Cunning diplomacy and psychological warfare were equally potent. Throughout the 440s, Attila alternated devastating military campaigns with calculated negotiations. He extorted the Eastern Roman Empire for gold year after year, first £700, then £2,100 annually after he battered their armies in 447. The Eastern Emperor, Theodosius II, preferred paying off the Huns to facing them in battle, a policy that enriched Attila immensely. By the year 450, Attila's treasuries were brimming with tribute, and his warriors had gained seasoned experience from numerous skirmishes and sieges. Despite ruling over such wealth, Attila led a simple life by choice, akin to a warrior monk. Roman envoys who visited his encampment were astonished by his austerity. The historian Priscus, who dined with Attila during a diplomatic mission, recorded that while lavish food on silver platters was served to guests, Attila himself ate nothing but meat off a wooden trencher. He drank from a wooden cup, whereas his lieutenants sipped wine from gleaming goblets of gold. His clothes were plain and clean, devoid of the jewels that adorned other chieftains. Such discipline both impressed and unnerved the Romans. It suggested a man of unwavering determination, unaffected by decadence or distraction, a leader capable of instilling unwavering loyalty by empathizing with the struggles of his followers. Attila also had a mercurial temper and could be mercilessly cruel, but he tempered terror with moments of calculated mercy or humour, keeping even his closest followers guessing. Attila's worldview was steeped in omen and prophecy. Priscus noted that Attila consulted seers and believed in predictions about his lineage. One prophecy purportedly left him momentarily sombre. It foretold that disaster would eventually befall the Huns, though perhaps not in his lifetime. But such dark musings were rare. More often, Attila projected absolute confidence in his divinely sanctioned mission of conquest. He even co-opted Roman mystique for his ends. A chilling tale from Milan illustrates this. When Attila captured that proud Italian city in 452, he came across a fresco in the palace that depicted past Roman emperors seated on the thrones, which triumphed over the barbarian chiefs who were laid prostrate at their feet, conveying a sense of imperial arrogance. The scene of imperial arrogance enraged him. Attila immediately summoned an artist and ordered a new mural painted. In this revisionist artwork, Attila sat on the throne while cringing. Roman emperors knelt before him, pouring out bags of gold in tribute. With grim satisfaction, Attila essentially declared his reversal of fortune. Rome's days of victory were over. It was now the barbarians' turn to rule. Whether or not the story is apocryphal, it captures Attila's mindset. He was deliberately crafting an image, to Romans and to his people, that the Hun was the new master of the world and Rome's proud eagles would bow to the rider of the steppes. While Leo advanced north, Attila the Hun drove his war host relentlessly south. To understand the collision course of these two figures, one must step into Attila's world, a world of vast open. The vast steppes echoed with thundering hooves, symbolizing a destiny forged in blood and superstition. Attila was no ordinary barbarian chieftain. He styled himself as something far grander, even cosmic. A legend circulated among his people that a sacred weapon had fallen into Attila's hands, the sword of Mars. A humble shepherd, the story went, discovered an ornate sword in a field, revealed by the blood of a limping heifer. He presented it to Attila, who exulted in the find. Believing it a gift from the war god, whom Romans identified as Mars, Attila took it as a sign of divine favour. He thought he had been appointed ruler of the whole world, and that through the sword of Mars supremacy in all wars was assured to him. So writes the historian Jordanes, echoing the accounts of Attila's contemporaries. Armed with this talisman and unshakable self-confidence, Attila saw himself as an instrument of godly wrath, a scourge sent upon the earth. Indeed, later Romans would call him flagellum Dei, the scourge of God, believing that he was a punishment for the sins of humankind. Under Attila's command, the Hunnic Empire reached its zenith. From the plains of Hungary across the Danube and into Germany, he united a confederation of Huns, Alans, Ostrogoths, and other tribes through charisma and fear. He became sole ruler in 445 after allegedly murdering his brother Bleda, an act that removed the last check on his power. Ruthless as he was, Attila was also a shrewd strategist. He realised that brute force alone wouldn't sustain his dominion. Cunning diplomacy and psychological warfare were equally potent. Throughout the 440s, Attila alternated devastating military campaigns with calculated negotiations. He extorted the Eastern Roman Empire for gold year after year, first £700, then £2,100 annually after he battered their armies in 447. The Eastern Emperor, Theodosius II, preferred paying off the Huns to facing them in battle, a policy that enriched Attila immensely. By the year 450, Attila's treasuries were brimming with tribute, and his warriors had gained seasoned experience from numerous skirmishes and sieges. Despite ruling over such wealth, Attila led a simple life by choice, akin to a warrior monk. Roman envoys who visited his encampment were astonished by his austerity. The historian Priscus, who dined with Attila during a diplomatic mission, recorded that while lavish food on silver platters was served to guests, Attila himself ate nothing but meat off a wooden trencher. He drank from a wooden cup, whereas his lieutenants sipped wine from gleaming goblets of gold. His clothes were plain and clean, devoid of the jewels that adorned other chieftains. Such discipline both impressed and unnerved the Romans. It suggested a man of unwavering determination, unaffected by decadence or distraction, a leader capable of instilling unwavering loyalty by empathizing with the struggles of his followers. Attila also had a mercurial temper and could be mercilessly cruel, but he tempered terror with moments of calculated mercy or humour, keeping even his closest followers guessing. Attila's worldview was steeped in omen and prophecy. Priscus noted that Attila consulted seers and believed in predictions about his lineage. One prophecy purportedly left him momentarily sombre. It foretold that disaster would eventually befall the Huns, though perhaps not in his lifetime. But such dark musings were rare. More often, Attila projected absolute confidence in his divinely sanctioned mission of conquest. He even co-opted Roman mystique for his ends. A chilling tale from Milan illustrates this. When Attila captured that proud Italian city in 452, he came across a fresco in the palace that depicted past Roman emperors seated on the thrones, which triumphed over the barbarian chiefs who were laid prostrate at their feet, conveying a sense of imperial arrogance. The scene of imperial arrogance enraged him. Attila immediately summoned an artist and ordered a new mural painted. In this revisionist artwork, Attila sat on the throne while cringing. Roman emperors knelt before him, pouring out bags of gold in tribute. With grim satisfaction, Attila essentially declared his reversal of fortune. Rome's days of victory were over, It was now the barbarians' turn to rule. Whether or not the story is apocryphal, it captures Attila's mindset. He was deliberately crafting an image, to Romans and to his people, that the Hun was the new master of the world and Rome's proud eagles would bow to the rider of the steppes. In the sultry August of 452, northern Italy lay crushed under the Huns' heel. The Huns trampled fields, left villages empty, and filled the air with thick smoke from burnt towns. Down the ancient Via Aemilia, a strange procession made its way against this tide of destruction. Pope Leo I, mounted perhaps on a sturdy mule or horse, led a small band of envoys and clergy steadily northward. Each mile brought new evidence of Attila's wrath. Charred farmsteads, refugees huddled by the roadside, and tales of unspeakable carnage. Leo's heart must have been heavy, yet he pressed on, radiating a calm conviction that bewildered those who met him. There are accounts of peasants kneeling as he passed, as if sensing that this man carried the last hope of Rome on his shoulders. Clad in the simple white garments of a bishop, Leo cut an incongruous figure on a battlefield. But to the desperate Italians, the sight of the unarmed pope heading toward the invader inspired a flicker of faith. If anyone could appeal to Attila's mercy, perhaps it was this saintly man. Meanwhile, Attila had pitched camp near the Mincio River, not far from where it flows into the Great Po. The summer heat and disease in his ranks urged him to conclude business quickly. Rome beckoned just over the horizon. Attila sent scouts ahead toward the capital, who returned with curious news. The city's gates were still shut, no army in sight. Instead, a delegation of high-ranking Romans was coming to parley. Attila agreed to receive them. Perhaps he believed that a quick negotiation could secure both a hefty ransom and Honoria's hand, which would allow him to claim victory without further bloodshed. Or perhaps he relished making Rome prostrate itself. Either way, a meeting was arranged on the open plain. Attila ordered his war tent prepared with appropriate pomp. The Hun camp bustled. Banners emblazoned with dragon motifs fluttered, horses neighed, and rings of leather tents stretched to the horizon. Battle-scarred warriors, curious about the Roman Pope, gathered at a respectful distance when the envoys arrived. They came in state. Leo, flanked by the ex-consul Avienus, and ex-prefect Tragetius, and attended by a train of priests bearing processional crosses and icons. To Attila's warriors, the scene was a novel sight. Romans without weapons, carrying only strange symbols and moving with solemn purpose. Under the bright sky, Pope Leo and Attila the Hun finally came face to face. The moment was historic. The soft-spoken Holy Father and the scourge of nations. Despite being in his early 60s, Leo stood with dignified bearing. Attila, a middle-aged man of middling height with a man with a broad chest and weathered face, regarded the Pope intently. Attila was known for his habit of rolling his fierce eyes to intimidate those in front of him. One might imagine he attempted the same on Leo, yet Leo did not flinch. Clad in simple robes, the Pope met the barbarian's gaze with steady, compassionate eyes. An observer described Leo at that encounter as fearless, as one who trusts not in himself but in God. Attila, who had terrorized tens of thousands, now encountered a man who showed no fear. The conversation that unfolded has been lost to time. No transcript exists, but through various accounts and a dose of imagination, we can reconstruct its tenor. First, the Roman envoys likely offered formal salutations. Avienus, experienced in diplomacy, probably spoke, "Attila, most noble leader of the Huns, we come on behalf of the Senate and people of Rome." They might have offered gifts, chests of gold or jewelled goblets, tokens of Rome's esteem or desperation. Attila listened impatiently. Then Pope Leo addressed the warlord. Unlike the perfumed senators of the East who had grovelled before Attila in past embassies, Leo's voice was neither sycophantic nor cowering. He spoke plainly, demonstrating both grave respect and authority. Through an interpreter, for Attila, who understood Latin only a little, Leo appealed to humanity in the Hun. He acknowledged Attila's victories. You have been the instrument of divine justice, punishing the sins of the land. Such words, crediting God for Attila's success, may have intrigued the superstitious king. Leo continued, perhaps urging Attila to show mercy now that his mission of chastisement was fulfilled. He might have invoked the fate of conquerors who failed to temper justice with mercy. Certainly Leo reminded Attila of the transience of mortal life. One chronicler imagined Leo saying, "We are all mortals, O king, sooner or later we return to dust. Seek not the further spilling of innocents' blood, but earn everlasting glory by sparing Rome." Attila responded brusquely. One can picture his scowling visage as he listed his demands. Through the interpreter he likely thundered that Honoria, the imperial princess who had appealed to him, be handed over at once with her rightful inheritance, the dowry he claimed. He may have also demanded an annual tribute of gold from Rome to replace what the Eastern Empire had stopped paying. Attila was a man used to dictating terms, yet even as he spoke something gnawed at him. Here was this unarmed priest calmly rebutting the scourge of God. Leo answered Attila's demands firmly. The emperor could not yield his sister as a bride, for that matter was already settled. Honoria had been punished for her rash offer. As for tribute, Leo likely pleaded that Italy was spent and ravaged. There was little left to give. Perhaps he offered what he could from the church's treasury, emphasizing that further devastation would only bring diminishing returns. A starved, plague-ridden land would profit no conqueror. As the negotiations seesawed, Attila's temper might have flared, but each time Leo responded with steady reasoning and moral exhortation. He reminded Attila of Alaric's fate. The Goth had died soon after taking Rome. Was it truly wise to risk the same anger of heaven? Attila's pagan priests in his retinue exchanged nervous glances. They too had heard the stories. The Hunnic king, despite his bravado, felt a chill. At that very moment, according to the later legend, miraculous vision sealed the outcome. Attila suddenly fell silent, eyes widening at a point above Leo's head. To his astonishment, he beheld what seemed to be two towering figures in the air, saintly men clad in armour, one carrying a sword that blazed in the sunlight. These spectral warriors, who were visible only to Attila, glared at him as if to say, "Do not touch this man or this city." Paul the Deacon, a writer from centuries later, would identify the warriors as the apostles Peter and Paul who had come from heaven to protect Rome. Attila, who believed in omens, felt a stab of fear. Was this a divine warning? Whether one credits the miracle or not, something stirred in Attila. He, who had never lost a negotiated advantage, suddenly softened. The fierce light in his eyes dimmed. Attila, the untamable, gazed at Pope Leo's peaceful face and found no enemy there, only a beseeching father figure. In that instant, the dynamics shifted. Attila raised a hand, signalling an end to the debate. He announced his decision. The Huns would withdraw. He would spare Rome. The Roman envoys must have suppressed a deep sense of relief upon hearing those words. Terms were likely agreed upon, perhaps a one-time payment of gold, certainly a promise that Honoria's issue would be dropped. Attila made a final pronouncement, half warning, half concession. "Tell your emperor this. This peace is not permanent. If Rome wishes to remain safe, let it remember to give Attila what is Attila's." It was merely a show of strength to maintain the status quo. Leo inclined his head, accepting the conditions, whatever they were, and offered a blessing. The meeting was over. Attila had yielded, against all expectation. The Pope and his party turned back toward Rome, carrying the almost unbelievable news. Behind them, Attila retired to his camp, pensive. The sun was dipping low as the two groups parted ways. Roman chroniclers later rejoiced that no sword was drawn that day, no blood spilled. A battle had been won by words and faith alone. Attila's chieftains were astonished. Some protested, "Shall the mighty Attila be turned back by a preacher's tongue?" But others, those who knew of the worsening supplies and the whispers of plague, were secretly glad. They feared a doomed assault on Rome as much as any Roman did. In the privacy of his tent that night, Attila brooded. Perhaps he felt an unaccustomed twinge of admiration for Leo, or perhaps simply relief that he could retreat without testing Rome's cursed fate. Either way, the decision was made. By dawn, the Hunnic banners were pointed north. The scourge of God began his march out of Italy. Pope Leo I had achieved an unimaginable feat. He gazed into the eyes of the most feared man on earth, causing him to blink. Rome was saved, at least for that season. Raphael's famed fresco in the Vatican, painted over 1,000 years later, dramatizes the legend. Pope Leo, depicted serenely on horseback, raises a hand toward Attila, while above the Pope, 2 warrior saints brandish swords in the sky. This artistic fantasy captures the essence of how contemporaries and posterity viewed the encounter in 452, a turning point where the tide of destruction miraculously halted at the gates of Rome. Leo saved Rome on that fateful day near Mantua, not through the use of force, but through the strength of his character and faith. The aftermath of the meeting was immediate and profound. As word spread that Attila had turned back, a wave of incredulous joy swept through Italy. In Rome, anxious citizens waiting for news could scarcely believe it. The city and their lives had been spared. Many attributed it entirely to divine intervention thanks to Leo's sanctity. The Pope's status reached unprecedented heights. Rome welcomed him back as Pater Patria, the father of the fatherland, a title no humble churchman had ever held. The relieved Romans truly deserved to call Leo Magnus the Great. Historians through the ages have debated why Attila withdrew. Some near-contemporary observers, like the chronicler Prosper of Aquitaine, insisted that it was Leo's personal impact on Attila that made the difference, that the Hun was so impressed by the holy man's courage and eloquence that he simply gave up his designs. Another source, the historian Priscus, who knew Attila's court firsthand, offered a more pragmatic rationale. Attila's men were growing afraid. They recalled how Alaric had died after sacking Rome, and they urged Attila not to invite a similar curse. Modern scholars point to logistics and disease. Indeed, a later chronicle suggests that at that very time, plague was ravaging Attila's army, and supplies were running perilously low, while the Eastern Emperor Marcian had dispatched troops to harry Attila's homeland. Surrounded by ill omens, sickness in camp, hostile forces gathering elsewhere, and the psychological weight of Rome's spiritual clout, Attila likely calculated that discretion outweighed valour. Whatever mix of motives one assigns, the result is indisputable. Attila suddenly retreated, and he never returned. The scourge of God had scourged enough. Leo's triumph, however, was not a permanent deliverance. He knew as much. According to ancient accounts, Attila sent a message upon his departure, threatening to return unless Honoria handed over her inheritance. Attila made this gesture to save face, but in reality he had lost his chance. The following year, in 453, Attila the Hun tragically passed away on the eve of his latest wedding feast. The legendary conqueror succumbed not on the battlefield but in his marital bed, reportedly bursting a blood vessel and choking on his blood after heavy drinking. His bride Ildiko awoke to a corpse. The superstitious saw divine justice in this inglorious end. With Attila's death, the unity of the Hunnic Empire perished. His sons quarrelled and, within a decade, the Huns ceased to be a major threat. Rome had survived Attila. However, the lifespan of the Western Roman Empire was short. In 455, just 3 years after Leo's encounter with Attila, Rome faced another deadly menace. Genseric, king of the Vandals, sailed his fleets from North Africa and landed at Ostia. This time there was no massive barbarian host at the gates, but a naval invasion. Emperor Valentinian III had been assassinated. Political chaos reigned. Once again, Leo filled the void. Unarmed and accompanied by his clergy, he went out to meet Genseric, employing the same courage and moral plea he had with Attila. The Vandal was a different man, however, and negotiations yielded only a partial success. Genseric agreed not to burn the city or massacre its inhabitants. but he would plunder, and plunder he did. For 2 weeks in June 455, the Vandals methodically looted Rome. The treasures of ages, the temple of Jupiter's gilded roof and the spoils Titus had taken from Jerusalem, were carted off to Vandal Africa. Leo could not prevent this humiliation. Nonetheless, even Genseric's begrudging restraint was attributed to Leo's influence. The Pope's entreaties at least spared Rome the flames. The massive basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul, where terrified citizens had flocked for sanctuary, were left intact by Vandal hands. This mitigation counted as another testimony to Leo's clout. Once more, the secular authorities had utterly failed, and once more it was Leo, and Leo alone, who stood as Rome's protector. Pope Leo I lived on for a few more years after these tumultuous events, dying in 461. He was buried as a hero in Rome, his tomb adorned with the inscription Defender of the City. His legacy only grew with time. In ecclesiastical history, Leo is remembered for his theological contributions, the Tome of Leo and the strengthening of papal primacy. But in popular memory, it was the day he saved Rome that truly made him a legend. Over the centuries, the story of Leo and Attila acquired an almost mythical aura. Medieval writers embroidered it freely. The apparition of Saints Peter and Paul threatening Attila, hinted at in Paul the Deacon's 8th century account, became a staple of the tale. Artists immortalized the scene. Apart from Raphael's Renaissance fresco, earlier the Baroque sculptor Algardi carved a grand relief in St. Peter's itself, showing Leo backed by heavenly figures driving away the Hun. Such images reinforced the narrative that Rome was saved not by human might but by divine intervention, channeled through Leo the Great. Yet for all the embellishment, the core truth endures and rings down the ages. In a moment of existential peril, when the material defences of an ancient civilization had failed, one man's moral courage prevailed. Leo's encounter with Attila stands as a testament to the power of persuasion over the sword and of faith over fear. It highlights the shifting world of the 5th century. As the Western Empire crumbled, the spiritual authority of the Church was rising to fill the void. Leo's success with Attila wasn't just a lucky diplomatic coup, it was a sign of the new epoch dawning. In the centuries that followed the fall of Rome, the last emperor would be deposed in 476, just 24 years after Leo's stand. The bishops of Rome, now firmly called popes, would increasingly assume roles of civic leadership, protectors, and power brokers in the remnants of empire. Leo had set the example. He showed that a pope could marshal not armies, but something perhaps equally compelling: moral suasion, unity, and hope in the face of despair. In separating myth from reality, modern historians acknowledge the practical factors that led to Attila's retreat: hunger, disease, and strategic considerations, but they also acknowledge that Leo's diplomatic mission was crucial. Without it, Attila might have lingered long enough to sack Rome before those factors fully unravelled his campaign. Leo gave Attila a face-saving exit and a spiritual scare to boot. That was enough. In the summer of 422, an unlikely saviour in a plain cassock saved the Eternal City from annihilation. For the generation that witnessed it, there could be no doubt. Pope Leo I had saved Rome. It was a bright spot in an age of collapse, a story retold with gratitude and awe. To this day, when one stands in St. Peter's and looks up at the marble relief of Leo driving away Attila, one is reminded of the power of courage and faith to alter the course of history. In Leo's voice lay the echo of an empire's spirit, and the promise that even in history's darkest chapters, a single steadfast soul can shine brightly enough to turn back the tide of destruction, if only for a moment. And occasionally that moment is all that civilization needs to survive. The sun set on the Western Roman Empire not with a single cataclysm, but through decades of slow decay. Pope Leo I, however, had already sealed his place in the annals of survival, diplomacy, and faith. As Rome's political fabric crumbled, Leo's influence continued to expand. Even in death in 461, his legacy was carried on by popes who modelled themselves not just after St. Peter, but after Leo's blend of spiritual fervour and diplomatic steel. His tomb in the old St. Peter's Basilica became a shrine not only of theological memory, but of civic pride, a place Romans could point to and say, "This man stood when others fled." The 5th century saw chaos, fragmentation and loss. Italy became a patchwork of Gothic rulers, Gaul drifted toward Frankish hands, and Africa became a Vandal kingdom. Yet the institutional church remained remarkably cohesive. This was, in part, Leo's doing. His letters had established a papal administrative style that reached bishops far beyond the crumbling empire's borders. His tome had crystallized Christology for centuries to come. His sermons, preserved, copied and studied, continued to nourish Christian identity in a post-imperial world. Yet the story of Leo's meeting with Attila continued to evolve, not just in church memory but in public imagination. The miracle, whether historically accurate or not, resonated deeply. In a world of collapsing order, the myth of a shepherd confronting the wolf and turning him away felt truer than any dusty chronicle. Artists, poets, theologians, and even emperors clung to this narrative. Leo's courage became archetypal, echoed in later eras when popes would stand up to kings, emperors, or even fascist regimes. Meanwhile, Attila's name lived on in darker legend. Although Attila died in 453 AD under anticlimactic circumstances, drunk and bleeding on his wedding night, his empire soon dissolved afterward. His sons quarrelled over the remnants, the cohesion of the Hunnic tribes vanished. By the end of the 5th century, the Huns were no longer a power, not even a memory in the lands they once terrorized. In some parts of Europe, parents no longer warned children about the Huns. The threat had passed, yet Leo's voice still echoed from pulpits. Over time, Rome transitioned from the capital of a political empire to the symbolic heart of Christendom. This transformation was neither inevitable nor easy. It took figures like Leo, resolute, theologically sharp and diplomatically fearless, to steer the city from imperial ruin toward ecclesiastical prominence. One could argue that the Papal States, medieval Christendom, and even the Vatican City of today trace a straight line from Leo's model of papal leadership. He proved the Church could not only survive political collapse, it could redefine power entirely. The sculpture in St. Peter's Basilica by Alessandro Algardi, completed in the 17th century, immortalizes the scene with drama. Leo raises his hand, angelic warriors bear down from the heavens upon Attila, frozen in awe. It is theatrical, yes, but theatre with purpose. It reminds viewers that history is made not only through armies and battles, but through moments of extraordinary moral courage. That was Leo's gift to his age and ours, a vision of spiritual authority that was not passive, not withdrawn, but deeply engaged in the mess of human affairs. In the end, the day Leo saved Rome was not about political negotiation alone. It was a cultural pivot point. He demonstrated that faith could influence diplomacy, that courage didn't necessitate a sword, and that at times defending civilization could be achieved by a single man with unwavering conviction, bravely stepping into the depths of darkness. And just like that, we've reached the end of our main story tonight. How Pope Leo I did the impossible to save Rome is a reminder that sometimes words, not weapons, decide the fate of empires. The story tonight transported us to a time when the eternal city was on the brink of destruction, and the courage, diplomacy, and quiet strength of one man halted the destruction. We explored not just the historical weight of his actions, but the almost surreal calm he brought in the face of chaos. If you're still struggling to fall asleep, don't worry. More stories are coming designed to untangle the mind and ease you into a gentler rhythm. I love guiding you through these moments in history, and I'm honoured to help you find rest. You deserve peace, no matter how heavy the day has been, especially at the beginning of the week. Now I'll sit by the fire and sip my tea while the echoes of ancient footsteps fade away. Sweet dreams, my friends. And as always, sleep tight and good night. From the vantage of old Macedonia, where elders gathered beneath olive trees to swap hushed lore, The story of Hercules emerged in sparks of disbelief. They whispered about a force that blurred the boundaries between the mortal and divine realms. This child, born in modest Tiryns, possessed an unsettling gift. Feats of strength performed so calmly that some wondered if the gods had quietly laid a blessing or a curse at his feet. Tiryns was a farming community framed by rocky hills and cloud-strewn skies, a place defined by the routine labour and rigid social caution. The boy's first display of uncanny power was witnessed by a shepherd. With a single tug, he reined in an ox known to drag grown men like ragdolls. It wasn't the show of force itself that troubled onlookers. It was the eerie silence with which he did it, as though testing a boundary rather than revelling in might. Soon, neighbours recalled other oddities, doors unhinged by a careless push, footprints left in stone, and animals that yielded to his hand without resistance. Though some saw him as Tiryns' protector in training, others felt uneasy. Mortals were fragile beings. Gifts of such magnitude often drew divine ire. Hercules, for his part, behaved like any curious youth, combing riverbanks for turtles or carving shapes into the soft rock. Yet beneath each childlike pastime lurked an awareness of difference. He sensed that the world around him fit like a shirt one size too small, familiar but constricting. A single miscalculation could fracture relationships or destroy trust. As he neared 15, rumours of unnatural predators swept across the farmland. Shepherds muttered of wolves the size of ponies, with eyes lit by feral intelligence. The local militia dared not test the truth of those claims, leaving the fields in a state of hush. Hercules, compelled by equal parts curiosity and duty, gathered a simple spear and ventured into the pine forests alone. For 3 nights the darkness swallowed him. On the 4th dawn he reappeared at the village edge, clothes torn, blood running down his arms. Yet he carried no trophy, only the quiet certainty that the threat was gone. Word of his deeds spread through travellers' wagons and along shepherds' routes, echoing into lands beyond. It was said that the monstrous wolves vanished as swiftly as they had come. In the villagers' eyes, such might have signalled a guardian, or even a chosen instrument of the gods. Soon they built humble altars to honour him. They offered tiny bowls of grain and small cups of wine as offerings to the boy who had ensured their nights. Hercules accepted none of it openly. He would pause at those altars, gaze at them in faint puzzlement, then slip away. Inside him, a tug of longing clashed with the weight of expectation. He cherished the farmland's rhythms, morning light over tilled earth, the lull of cicadas in the summer. Yet each casual greeting now carried a jolt of awe, and every dirt path he roamed felt narrower, as though funneling him towards some vast unseen road. Occasionally, he stole into the hills to commune with nature's raw pulse, pressing his broad hands against boulders as though listening for whispered secrets of stone. Tiryns was never the seat of sophistication, unlike Athens or Thebes. It lacked gilded temples and philosophical gatherings. In a way, the simplicity of Tiryns allowed Hercules to flourish without being overwhelmed by rumours. People accepted him, half wary, half hopeful, because they needed him. He held back storms that might devour them in a single gulp. He soon learned of a summons from King Eurystheus of Mycenae, a monarch who demanded fealty and recognised the usefulness of a mortal wielding near-divine might. Friends warned him of palace politics. Even the local priest, stooped with age, cautioned that power-hungry rulers often feed on legends until there is little left of the legend itself. However, Hercules sensed an unspoken reminder that a simple shepherd's life would never be his. Gathering sparse belongings, he took one last look at the farmland, the lopsided fences, the distant bleating of goats that once filled his childhood mornings. Then, as dawn's first gleam touched the horizon, he set out for Mycenae. Those who witnessed his departure claimed a hush fell upon Tiryns, like the land itself held its breath, waiting. The path he walked would lead to triumph and sorrow, forging a destiny both luminous and shattering. In his heart, Hercules hoped to find a way back to quiet fields someday, but deep down He suspected the gods had other plans entirely. The road to Mycenae stretched through rolling plains dotted with olive groves and jagged hillsides. Hercules travelled quietly, observing the land more than pondering the future. Yet he couldn't ignore the murmur that followed him, a hum of anticipation carried by traders, roadside shepherds, and vagrant bards. Upon arrival at the fortified city, he faced a spectacle: drummers at the gates, banners hoisted high, and crowds craning to see if a rumour exceeded reality. King Eurystheus' palace gleamed atop a rise of white stone. Once inside, Hercules found himself before a ruler whose thin lips twitched at each mention of his name. Despite grandiose surroundings, Eurystheus exuded an air of self-importance, undermined by a hint of anxiety. In the hushed court, courtiers eyed Hercules with an odd mix of curiosity and caution. They had heard the rumours of unstoppable strength. Now they assessed the man himself, broad-shouldered, wind-beaten, eyes calm as still water. Eurystheus wasted no time. "Word of your deeds has travelled far," he said, feigning warmth. "To prove your loyalty, you shall fulfil labours for the glory of Mycenae. And the gods, of course." Applause followed from courtiers, though it felt forced. Hercules bowed, not out of fear, but recognizing that refusal would brand him an enemy of a kingdom that seemed both powerful and petty. Besides, he sensed destiny's nudge again, that intangible force hinting these labours might shape his future. His first assignment, the Nemean lion. Villagers near Nemea spoke of a cat the size of a warhorse, its fur impervious to spears or arrows. Eurystheus demanded its pelt as proof. Setting out with minimal supplies, Hercules ventured into a region shadowed by tall grasses and jagged rock. On the second day, he spotted massive paw prints pressed into the soil. Following them, he entered a dank cavern overhung by dripping vines. The lion emerged, its coat shimmering like steel. Arrows snapped against its hide, confirming the rumours. They grappled, the beast roaring with unnatural ferocity while Hercules wrestled in silence, locking powerful arms around the creature's neck. At last, he wrenched it downward, ending its life with a blow that reverberated in his bones. No victory cry escaped his lips, only relief. He skinned the lion with its claws and then draped the pelt over his shoulder. When he returned, Eurystheus balked at the sight of that massive trophy. Commanding the city gates shut, he insisted Hercules remain outside, guilty of displaying future conquests from a distance. Thus began a curious ritual. Each time Hercules completed a labour, the king would peer down from the safety of high walls, making excuses to avoid direct contact. The champion, calm in compliance, never argued. He found no pride in forcing an audience. Fulfilling duty was enough. Shortly after, he faced the Lernaean Hydra, a serpent with 9 heads that regrew if cut. Hercules approached the swamp of Lerna, its murky waters stinking of rot. He attacked, but each severed head sprouted 2 more, only with the help of his nephew Iolaus, who cauterized each stump with torchlight. Did Hercules triumph? Lifting the central head, still hissing in death, he returned to Mycenae. The king, peering over parapets, dismissed the victory. "You had help," he sneered. Yet the people watching from afar marvelled. Labourers mounted. The Cyrenaian hind, sacred to Artemis, tested his finesse. He chased it for a year across forests and streams before cornering the golden-antlered creature. Rather than slay it, he merely captured and displayed it, then set it free, earning grudging respect from the goddess. He subdued the Erymanthian boar, bringing it back alive. After each feat, Eurystheus found reasons to belittle it. Still, word spread, forging Hercules' name into a legend that outgrew even the king's attempts to contain it. Hercules, tasked with cleaning the Augean stables, an impossible mass of filth left for decades, diverted 2 rivers in a single day, washing away the grime and exposing the stable's owner, Augeas, for his dishonesty. Along the way, The hero recognised these tasks weren't simply chores from a cowardly king, they served as rites of passage. Each labour illuminated facets of responsibility, cunning, and mercy. Yet Hercules also sensed a growing gulf between himself and normal life. Day by day, the realm saw him less as a man and more as a living weapon. Behind the feats and rumours loomed an unspoken shadow. Stories hinted he was atoning for a private tragedy caused by a divine curse. He carried that burden silently, forging ahead on a path paved by others' demands. In fulfilling each new labour, Hercules grew ever more certain that his real battle lay within, a test to see whether monstrous foes or guilt from a past soaked in blood would claim him first. Over time, Eurystheus' list of labours seemed an endless well of peril. Some missions exuded a sense of malice, as if the king aimed to eliminate Hercules by challenging him to confront real-life nightmares. Yet it wasn't the magnitude of tasks that hollowed Hercules' spirit. It was the sense that each success fueled the king's resentment. Mycenae now revered a champion who strode in only to drop proof of another victory before vanishing again. At dawn one day, a messenger gasping for breath approached Hercules outside the city walls. A threat lurked by Lake Stymphalus, where ravenous birds terrorized farmers. Their iron-like feathers cut flesh, and the beating of their wings filled the sky with a menacing clang. Stymphalian birds were rumoured to be spawn of an ancient curse, feasting on anyone who strayed near the marsh. Eurystheus' decree was terse: exterminate them. Travelling to the lake, Hercules found the marshland choked with tall reeds and stagnant water. At dusk, he glimpsed shadowy shapes perched in twisted trees. Arrows alone wouldn't suffice. For every creature he felled, others scattered into the gloom. Recalling an old tale, he fashioned bronze clappers, forging a racket so loud it startled the flock skyward. As they took flight, he shot them down systematically. Their carcasses drifted into reeds, painting the swamp red under the waning sun. The few that escaped took the legend of this unstoppable archer with them. More labour followed. Fetching the Cretan bull, a massive beast rumoured to breathe fire, brought him face to face with an animal maddened by captivity. Rather than slay it, he subdued it and brought it to Mycenae, only to watch Eurystheus cower behind the gate. Later, capturing the mares of Diomedes required wrestling savage horses bred for violence. Some say Hercules fed Diomedes to his mares in a moment of grim poetic justice, ending their thirst for human flesh. Yet it was an act that left Hercules uneasy. Dispatching a tyrant solved one evil, but the memory haunted him. What lines separated righteous punishment from barbarity? In these wanderings, he discovered people who welcomed him as a living legend, yet recognized his underlying melancholy. Children peered around corners, hoping to see the giant who wrestled monsters. Old men offered wine, praising him as champion of the downtrodden. Occasionally, Hercules paused to help build a wall or fix a broken roof, acts of normalcy that anchored him to everyday life. But the moment always came when a new labour call or a rumour of a monstrous threat demanded his presence. At night, he grappled with nightmares. The unwritten story behind his forced servitude gnawed at him, a rumour that he'd once been driven crazed by Hera's wrath, causing him to commit unspeakable deeds against those he loved. Although few dared mention it aloud, the weight of that guilt never left his eyes. Even the unstoppable Hercules could not outrun sorrow that sprang from within. Eventually, Eurystheus delivered yet another test, to steal the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the warrior women known as Amazons. In a land beyond the Aegean, Hercules came upon a culture of disciplined fighters who lived independent of typical patriarchal laws. Initially, Hippolyta welcomed dialogue, impressed by rumours of a hero who balanced power with compassion. She considered granting him the girdle as a diplomatic gesture, but Hera, ever meddlesome, spread deceit among the Amazons, whispering that Hercules planned to abduct their queen. In the ensuing chaos, swords clashed, alliances shattered, and Hippolyta fell. Dying, she handed the girdle to Hercules, her expression etched with betrayal and sorrow. He departed with the prize, cursing the gods who twisted every peaceful solution into conflict. This pattern of tragedy bled across each mission. The more he accomplished, the less solace he found. The blame was easily laid at Eurystheus' feet, but Hercules understood that the seeds of discord came from the gods themselves, and from his heart, burdened by regrets. No monstrous hydra or invulnerable lion caused him as much pain as the memories he couldn't erase. Each labour, though celebrated by others, felt like an extension of penance. Still Hercules pressed on, partially out of duty and partially from an instinct that stopping might let darker forces run rampant. He was no politician, no orator, but people believed in him, and in their belief, he found a reason to shoulder his tortured past. So he continued, forging alliances with honest souls, meeting cunning foes in remote lands, and slaying nightmares so ordinary folk could rest at night. Through scorching deserts and perilous seas, Hercules roamed like a wandering guardian. His reputation derived more from his deeds than his words. Even so, a question circled endlessly in his mind. Would saving the world ever wash away the blood on his conscience, or was he doomed to carry his haunted legacy until the end? As the labours approached their conclusion, Hercules observed a change in the political landscape. Mycenae's commoners adored him, weaving new songs about his might, but the court seethed with jealousy. King Eurystheus, cornered by his decree, pressed onward with increasingly brazen demands. He ordered Hercules to journey to the far edges of the known world. Some suspected the king hoped the hero would never return, sparing him the embarrassment of living in another man's shadow. A test soon arrived in the form of the cattle of Geryon, the creature Geryon, rumoured to have 3 bodies fused into one, reigned over a sun-scorched land beyond the pillars marking the westernmost boundary of mortal travel. The prize, a herd of crimson cattle prized by gods and kings alike. Hercules set off, crossing mountain passes, scorching deserts, and nameless seas. He famously split a landmass to create a strait, some said in a moment of frustration, others as a statement of power, raising what would later be called the Pillars of Hercules. He eventually arrived at Geryon's domain, where a monstrous hound guarded the cattle. Battling Geryon demanded strategy, for each torso wielded a different weapon. Hercules exploited the confusion, striking while the giant struggled to coordinate his 3 minds. With Geryon slain, he herded the cattle through hostile territories, clashing with thieves and hostile kings along the way. His triumphant return to Mycenae, driving those surreal red-hided animals, caused a stir of both admiration and dread. Yet Eurystheus welcomed him only from a safe distance. Soldiers corralled the cattle, sacrificing many on Eurystheus' orders. The more the king tried to belittle Hercules' efforts, the more ordinary citizens hailed the hero as a saviour of the realm. Privately, Hercules remained unmoved by their cheers. Each new conquest carried echoes of moral conflict, as if he were a blade used by manipulative hands. Another monumental feat involved the golden apples of the Hesperides, guarded by a serpent coiled in a hidden orchard. Tales said the apples conferred immortality, though most mortals never reached the far-flung garden. Hercules travelled for months, uncertain if such a place truly existed. Eventually he encountered Atlas, the titan condemned to hold the sky on his shoulders. Seizing an opportunity, Hercules offered to take that cosmic burden temporarily if Atlas would fetch the apples. Atlas retrieved them, but then tried to abandon Hercules, hoping to free himself from eternal torment. Through a cunning ploy, Hercules tricked Atlas into reclaiming the heavens, walking off with the fabled fruit. When he presented the golden apples to Eurystheus, the king had no idea what to do with them. Legend says Athena herself intervened, returning the apples to their rightful place. In that moment, Hercules glimpsed the gods' casual involvement. They toyed with mortal affairs, granting fleeting favours or curses, shaping destinies as one might shuffle coins. He realized that each labour was less about Eurystheus' commands and more about the god's inscrutable agenda and his path of atonement. Only one task remained: descending into the underworld to capture Cerberus, the three-headed hound of Hades. This final labour surpassed mortal limits, for no living soul dared approach that dismal realm without invitation. Hercules ventured down the dark corridors of the earth, guided by wailing spirits and the unrelenting pull of cosmic gloom. Before the throne of Hades, he offered to wrestle Cerberus barehanded if permitted to bring the beast to the surface. The god of the dead consented, more amused than alarmed. Their struggle was fierce. Each of Cerberus's heads snapped and snarled, snake-like tails lashing in fury. Yet the hero subdued the beast, hauling it above ground to Mycenae's gates. When Eurystheus saw the snarling hound of death, he hid, trembling behind his walls. Hercules, mission done, gently returned Cerberus to Hades. With all labours completed, Hercules stood outside Mycenae's walls, eyes on the fortress that had dominated his life. He expected neither thanks nor release, for he understood his service wasn't to Eurystheus but to something deeper. Turning from the city, he felt both emptiness and freedom. He had conquered beasts and braved terrors unknown to mortal men. Now, the question loomed: could he conquer the shadows that clung to his heart? He walked away, the crowds uncertain whether to weep at his departure or celebrate their king's deliverance from jealousy. Quietly, Hercules carried with him the echoes of every monstrous roar, every anguished cry, forging a destiny severed from royal commands but still bound by the god's inscrutable design. Released from Eurystheus' demands, Hercules drifted. Some claimed he roamed until he found a remote valley, building a modest home beside a sparkling brook. There, he tried to cultivate olives and vine crops, as though seeking normalcy. Villagers in the vicinity grew accustomed to spotting a giant figure mending fences or hauling timber. For the first time, he blended into daily life, if only briefly. Yet tranquility proved elusive. Strangers arrived, testing the legend. Some wanted to measure strength against the famed demigod, brandishing swords or arrogant boasts. Others offered alliances steeped in hidden agendas. Hercules repelled them, but each confrontation frayed the delicate peace. Rumours circulated about a new champion who might best him, and with each rumour came another challenger. Tiring of this drama, Hercules took to the road, relinquishing the valley to preserve its calm. He wandered from city to city, forging a reputation as a roving problem solver. In Attica, he drove away raiders who preyed on vulnerable farms. In Aetolia, he mediated disputes among tribal leaders too proud to seek peace themselves. Some towns offered him gold or titles, but he refused, yearning for something intangible that mortal wealth couldn't provide. Whispers of his identity preceded him. Children recited his labours as bedtime stories. Local bars named beverages after him, and travelling minstrels twisted details for dramatic flair. Along the way, Hercules encountered Deianira, a woman said to possess both keen intellect and resolute compassion. She saw through the aura of legend, urging him to confront the guilt that shadowed him. Her strength of spirit matched his physical might, and their bond blossomed into love. For a while, he believed he might carve out a life of shared purpose, perhaps leading a small settlement or teaching others to defend themselves without tyranny. They married, weaving fresh hopes into days that felt gentler. Yet the old cycles returned. One evening, while travelling together, they encountered the centaur Nessus at a river crossing. Nessus offered to ferry Deianira across the water, but partway he revealed his intent to abduct her. Hercules, swift to act, let an arrow fly, its tip laced with hydra poison. The wounded centaur collapsed, blood soaking the shore. In his final breaths, he whispered deceit to Deianira. Should she ever fear losing Hercules' love, A garment stained with his blood would bind him to her. Moved by desperation, she gathered some of that blood, too distraught to see the trap. Life continued. Hercules continued to be a wandering force, with Deianira either by his side or anxiously waiting at home. Over time, she worried about rumours of his infidelity. Travelling the world exposed him to temptations, and his legend drew admirers of every stripe. In a moment of fragile insecurity, she recalled Nessus's final words. She treated a robe with the centaur's blood, believing it a charm that would secure Hercules' devotion. When Hercules donned it, the old poison ignited like living fire, adhering to his flesh. He tore at the fabric, but the agony only worsened, ripping his skin away. Realizing the horrifying betrayal, he raged in confusion, not knowing the entire truth of why the robe burned him alive. Faced with the insurmountable pain, he sensed no earthly remedy could quell it. Deianira, horrified by what she had caused, either fled or took her life. Accounts differ. Hercules, in his torment, built a funeral pyre on Mount Rita, step by tortured step. He climbed, each footfall echoing the weights he'd carried all his life. Guilt, duty, heartbreak. He stretched himself upon the wood, begging for an end to his suffering. Flames were lit, devouring mortal flesh that once battled monsters and kings. Smoke curled toward the sky, bearing the essence of a hero who had saved entire realms yet failed to escape divine cunning and human frailty. Some say that in those final moments, Zeus intervened, lifting his son's immortal spirit to Olympus. Others claim Hercules simply became ash, the price of mixing superhuman deeds with all too human vulnerabilities. Wherever the truth lies, the legendary champion's last mortal breath vanished in wail, fulfilling of his destiny shaped by both triumph and agony. Even the wind seemed to pause in reverence, as though acknowledging that no beast or king had ever broken him as completely as love and betrayal. Hercules' end on Mount Weta thundered through the Greek world like a mournful lament. Those who'd admired him as a liberator stood in stunned silence, while others who had envied him spoke in hushed voices about the cruel caprice of fate. Priests in local temples offered contradictory explanations. Some insisted his spirit rose to the heavens, others deemed it just another tragic demise, albeit of an extraordinary mortal. In the weeks that followed, altars across the Aegean bore solemn offerings in his memory. Drips of wine, handfuls of grain, even small wood carvings depicting a lion's pelt or a hefty club. Ordinary folk struggled to reconcile the downfall of a figure who had bested lions, hydras, and giants. How could such a champion succumb to something as simple, yet devastating, as poisoned fabric? For many, it confirmed that no one, not even a demigod, was immune to the brutal interplay of divine grudges and human failings. At Mycenae, King Eurystheus' court reportedly watched the news unfold with uneasy satisfaction. Though the king had long resented Hercules, learning of his agonizing death offered no genuine relief, only a hollow sense that the realm's most potent shield was gone. Some whispered that if a champion like Hercules could be vanquished, perhaps the gods would turn a harsher eye on lesser mortals. Fear lingered in the corridors of their power, as though Hercules' fiery end had shifted the cosmic balance in unpredictable ways. Stories multiplied, as tales do. Certain bards favoured the uplifting version. Zeus, recognizing his son's heroism, welcomed him among the immortals. They spun visions of Hercules seated on Olympus, sipping ambrosia in the presence of swirling constellations. Others told the bleaker side, that the flames consumed not just his body, but every vestige of his once glorious spirit, scattering him into oblivion. Across the seas, foreign scribes embellished details, turning him into a half-legendary king in lands he never visited, or crediting him with feats he never performed. Amid these tales, Deianira's part in the tragedy sparked endless debate. Some portrayed her as a naive victim of Nessus's deception. Others painted her as a jealous spouse who rashly destroyed what she claimed to love. Still others insisted the real blame lay with the gods. To many listeners, it hardly mattered. Heartbreak had been the final monster Hercules couldn't defeat. Curiously, in small villages scattered near the sites of his labours, Hercules' memory retained a more grounded quality. In these pockets, older farmers recalled how he once repaired a broken dike or rescued a lost child in the midst of a colossal quest. Children heard bedtime stories of a giant who was kind enough to share bread with travellers in need. Here, the heroic feats remained awe-inspiring, but so did the everyday decency he displayed. Over time, that dichotomy, colossal strength paired with unfeigned humility, became the tapestry of his legend. Rulers from other city-states, seeing the potency of Hercules' name, erected shrines dedicated to him as a protective spirit. They wanted travellers to believe their territory enjoyed the hero's blessing. In some cities, small festivals arose, featuring contests of strength reminiscent of his fabled deeds. However, a whisper of caution permeated every public commemoration. Hercules had conquered monstrous beasts and overcome impossible tasks, yet a subtle sting from the mortal realm had undone him. Might alone could not outmaneuver fate or quell the complexities of love. For those who once knew him personally, warriors like Iolaus or local chiefs grateful for his help, his absence left an ache beyond description. They recalled the quiet convictions that guided him, the guilt that shadowed his eyes after each impossible feat. His final torment seemed a cosmic injustice, yet also a stark reminder that the line between divine and human was never clean. Hercules had walked that line throughout his life, wrestling monstrous forms on behalf of the powerless, while an invisible war of deities raged overhead. Over decades, recollections softened. Younger generations heard only the grand arcs, the Nemean lion, the Hydra, the unstoppable hero. Details of heartbreak and moral doubt vanished in the retellings, replaced by carved statues brandishing clubs or wearing lion skins. Yet in rare corners of Greece, the full story was preserved by those who had reason to remember. A titan among men who was neither wholly god nor entirely mortal, undone at last by the same vulnerabilities he had once tried to transcend. Thus, Hercules' flame burned on in the minds of those who found resonance in his struggles, even long after the funeral pyre's embers cooled to ash. Time and distance transformed Hercules from a man into a myth. Greek cities grew, allied and warred. New heroes rose and fell. In the retelling of old stories, his name emerged as a beacon of impossible feats. Philosophers invoked him as a parable, some praising perseverance, others warning against arrogance. In remote villages, older generations passed down more intimate accounts. How a colossal figure once mended a roof before chasing off marauders, or how he accepted a bowl of wine on a cold night without flaunting his stature. As the classical era gave way to Roman ascendancy, Hercules evolved into a Roman emblem. Soldiers prayed to Hercules Invictus, equating him with conquest and unrelenting will. Statues proliferated, from grand marble works in the Forum to tiny household shrines. Emperors, hungry for legitimacy, wrapped themselves in the demigod's imagery, hoping some shred of that timeless prowess might cloak their human frailties. However, the bragging about strength often overshadowed the deeper nuances of Hercules' trials. Centuries later, medieval scholars wrestled with pagan legacy, attempting to blend ancient myths into Christian frameworks. Hercules became a cautionary figure, powerful yet undone by sin and trickery. In the Renaissance, artists seized upon his heroic silhouette. Palaces displayed frescoes of him wrestling lions or heaving mountainsides, highlighting the human form in dynamic glory. Playwrights toyed with his persona, sometimes as tragic hero, sometimes as comedic foil, each era reinterpreting him anew. Despite these cultural metamorphoses, echoes of his true complexity endured. In certain monastic libraries, Meticulous scribes noted lesser-known episodes, the moral agony behind his labours, the heartbreak that ended his mortal story, and the persistent question of whether he ever truly found peace. For some, he embodied the tragedy of a life shaped by the divine lineage yet rooted in mortal limitations. For others, he served as a beacon of aspiration, proof that mortal will could confront even the gods' designs and sometimes triumph. Beyond texts and statuary, Hercules lived on in the intangible realm of folk memory. Fishermen off distant coasts recited short prayers to him before braving storms, as if the old guardian might still shield them from the sea's wrath. Caravans crossing desert routes invoked his name for safe passage. Parents, uncertain how to quiet a restless child at night, spun lullabies of a gentle giant who once fought off wolves so families could sleep in safety. These understated tributes carried forward the essence of a hero who, despite divine drama, always answered mortal need. For a contemporary observer, perhaps of the middle decades of life, Hercules' tale resonates on several levels. There's the unbridled strength of youth, those unstoppable surges of ambition or optimism. Then there's the gradual intrusion of responsibility, regret, and heartbreak. Middle age can bring reflection, how even the strongest among us wrestle with past mistakes, unfulfilled desires, and the weight of moral compromise. Hercules, with his unstoppable arms and vulnerable heart, mirrors that universal dilemma. Overall, it's the dualities that define him. Saviour and destroyer, victor and victim, demigod and man. He soared above mortal confines, yet remained shackled by the god's whims and his own remorse. Scholars today still debate the meaning of his final act. Was the funeral pyre a mere surrender to agony, or a deliberate transcendence of mortal bounds? Did the smoke carry him to Olympus, or was it a symbolic final note to the ballad of an exhausted hero? Some epilogues insist he found a measure of immortality, a seat among the pantheon, a cosmic nod to the labours he performed in the service of humanity and divine prerogative. Others claim his spirit roams the mortal realm, occasionally glimpsed in moments of dire need. Most accept that the ultimate truth, like so many ancient tales, remains wrapped in shifting layers of interpretation. And so Hercules remains, a fixture in the collective psyche. He stands for more than might alone. He stands for the cost of greatness, the fleeting nature of redemption, and the fragile boundary that separates gods from men. Whether chiselled in marble or accounted in a village tavern, his legend endures. He is the champion forever, forging new legends, even centuries after his final breath. In that sense, Hercules lives on wherever human hearts still strive, endure, and grapple with the powers, divine or earthly, that shape our destinies. When we think of the Great Depression, we see dust storms and breadlines in sepia. Before we can appreciate the psychological impact of the economic collapse, we must remember the world that was lost. A world of extraordinary optimism and excessive consumerism that few today can imagine. By 1988, Americans believed in endless prosperity almost religiously. The typical manufacturing pay has increased by approximately 40% since the early 1920s. Most new urban homes have indoor plumbing, long a luxury. In less than a decade, car ownership rose from 8 million to 23 million. Perhaps most telling, 40% of American families, not just the wealthy, but teachers, clerks, and factory workers, invested in the stock market. We thought we'd discovered economic immortality, said Philadelphia radio salesperson Martin Steinberg. My customers bought Philcos and RCAs on installment plans with 10% down. I set up their new consoles as they discussed their investments. Milton gave stock advice. Stock tips were given to the shoeshine boy. Those should have been warning signs, but we were drunk with affluence. Often forgotten is how boom times generated a strange isolation. Extended families that lived together for economic reasons split into nuclear units. Many young couples bought homes in new projects far from parents and grandparents. Americans' individualism and materialism damaged community institutions. Sunday became a day for new car drives, reducing church attendance. Local social clubs became commercial entertainment establishments. When the crash came, we discovered how much we'd sacrificed for material goods, remarked late 1920s Boston girl Eleanor Winthrop. At an insurance company, my father was well positioned. We owned a Packard, Frigidaire, and phone. We scarcely knew our neighbours. Everyone competed for new gadgets and things. We had little. When my father lost his job in 1930, we had limited resources. They didn't know us well enough to help, and we were ashamed to ask for assistance. American society's atomization would be deadly during the economic crisis. Many families suffered alone without community safety nets. American banks were unexpectedly vulnerable to financial instability's first tremors. In the 1920s, bank accounts were uninsured, unlike today's FDIC-insured deposits. Most Americans didn't know their deposits financed speculative investments. People viewed the collapse of rural banks in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as a local issue, affecting backward rural communities. Continental Illinois Bank's teller Harold Jenkins recalls the denial. Management assured us these rural bank failures in 28 were isolated cases attributable to deteriorating agricultural prices. The crucial connections were missed. Our loan officers approved mortgages with low down payments and margin loans for stock buyers. After the crash, our leaders claimed a correction. This institutional blindness included government. In early 1930, Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon famously said, "Gentlemen, liquidate labour, stocks, farms and real estate. We will eradicate the rot." A virtually medieval understanding of economics held that economic hardship was necessary to purify and rebuild the economy. This approach would delay significant involvement until millions were bankrupt. The psychological modifications forced on everyday Americans were most acute. The 1920s influenced consumer behavior significantly. Advertisements pitched products as conveniences and identity markers. A car or cigarette brand defined one's social status. Many suffered financial and existential crises when these material indicators disappeared. "We lost more than our money," said Mildred Hayes, a store clerk. "We forgot who we were. The life and future stories we told ourselves crashed. My husband was promoted to floor manager. We saved for a suburban house down payment. After his job loss, we moved in with his parents and slept on a fold-out couch in their parlour. How do you explain this reversal?" For millions of Americans, this cognitive dissonance between expectations and reality defined the early Depression. The world they were promised had vanished overnight, leaving them in strange territory without maps or goal guides. The financial collapse of 1929 to 1933 wasn't just about stock market losses affecting wealthy investors. What truly devastated ordinary Americans was the destruction of the banking system and, with it, their life savings. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks failed, nearly 40% of all banks in the United States. Each closure triggered cascading losses in communities where those banks operated. Unlike today's news cycle, which might report bank failures as abstract statistics, those closures were visceral, community-altering events. "I was walking to school when I saw the crowd outside First National," remembered Eunice Templeton, who was 12 years old in Galesburg, Illinois, when her town's largest bank closed. People were pounding on the doors, some women were crying. Mr. Hobart, who owned the hardware store, sat on the curb with his head in his hands. My father lost $800, his entire savings. That night, Mother cut up an old dress to make me a new one for school. "We have to be creative now," she said, her voice all tight like she was holding something back. What's rarely discussed in Depression histories is how the crisis transformed attitudes toward money itself. Before 1929, cash had been migrating from the mattress to the bank account as Americans embraced financial institutions. After the banking collapse, many developed a profound distrust of banks that would last generations. communities responded by developing extraordinary alternatives to traditional currency. In Minneapolis, the organised unemployed created script certificates tied to hours of work. In California's Imperial Valley, farmers traded promissory notes backed by future crops. In Seattle, professionals formed exchange networks where doctors and lawyers traded services directly with plumbers and electricians. Wayne Thornton, a plumbing contractor in Des Moines, described his experience. Money just disappeared. I had customers who needed leaks fixed but couldn't pay cash. I started taking chickens, home-canned vegetables, and even furniture in exchange for work. My secretary kept a ledger of who owed what. By 1922, I was only getting about 30% of my payments in actual currency. The rest was barter or promises. This collapse of conventional currency revealed something profound about money itself, that it exists primarily as a social agreement rather than an inherent value. When that agreement faltered, communities improvised alternatives based on trust and shared necessity. For children, the Depression's monetary lessons were particularly complex. Catherine Wagner, who grew up in San Francisco, recalled, "My father had been a successful attorney before the crash. Suddenly, he was accepting payment in firewood or fish. I remember asking for a nickel for candy, and my mother cried, not because we didn't have a nickel, we did, but because she understood that money now had to be hoarded, saved for absolute necessities." The Depression's monetary transformation was also visible in how physical currency was treated. Bills were pressed flat, coins were counted repeatedly, and cash was hidden in increasingly creative locations. Laura Hillman, whose father was a bank manager in Cincinnati, described finding money throughout their home after his death in 1940. There were silver dollars sewn into the hems of curtains, bills tucked between book pages, coins in sealed mason jars buried in the garden. Father knew better than anyone how fragile banks were, and it marked him permanently. Beyond the practical aspects of money's transformation was a deeper philosophical shift. Americans who had embraced consumer culture and defined themselves through purchases now found themselves questioning the basis of value itself. The arbitrary nature of monetary value became unavoidably apparent when homes with $5,000 mortgages sold at auction for $1,000, and when a skilled labourer's daily wage fell from $4 to $1, if work could be found at all. "We realised money was fictional," explained former banker Thomas Whitfield. "Not just paper money, but the whole concept. A house didn't change physically when its price dropped 80%, but suddenly the bank said it was worth a fifth of what they'd claimed last year. A man's labour didn't change when his wage was cut, but now an hour of sweat was worth half what it had been. This change made people question everything. This questioning extended to authority itself. When Presidents Hoover and Roosevelt made pronouncements about the economy, many Americans had become skeptical of official narratives. Having watched sound banks collapse and blue-chip stocks become worthless, they developed a wariness toward institutional pronouncements that would influence American politics for decades. The Depression's monetary chaos also produced unexpected social effects. As cash became scarce, those who still had it gained outsized influence. Small-town bankers who had maintained liquidity, landlords who owned properties outright, and business owners who had avoided debt found themselves with disproportionate community power. This shift created new social hierarchies based less on traditional status markers and more on financial prudence, a virtue that had been largely dismissed during the exuberant 1920s. "The social order flipped," observed Harriet Crawley, a schoolteacher from Virginia. "The flashy spenders of the 20s were now destitute, while cautious savers became community leaders. Everyone thought our principal was a frugal miser, but he was the only one who could provide small loans to prevent faculty members from losing their homes. His influence grew tremendously. The psychological impact of the Depression created wounds that statistics can't capture, invisible scars that shaped behaviours, relationships and worldviews for generations. While historians often focus on economic metrics, the true legacy lived in changed minds and hearts. For adults who had established identities and expectations before the crash, the psychological toll was particularly severe. Dr. Edwin Matthews, who practiced medicine in Cleveland throughout the 1930s, observed, "I treated physical ailments, malnutrition, tuberculosis exacerbated by poor housing, industrial injuries, but the most common problems were psychological. Insomnia plagued former businessmen. Digestive disorders affected women trying to feed families on inadequate budgets. I observed tremors in hands that had previously been steady. These stress-related ailments rarely appear in depression statistics, yet they affected millions. More startling were the invisible behavioral changes. People who had been outgoing became withdrawn. Decision-making became paralyzed by fear. Marriages strained under financial pressure developed communication patterns centered on avoidance rather than confrontation. My mother changed completely," said Richard Neville, who was 10 years old when his father lost his accounting position in 1931. Before, she'd been the neighbourhood social organiser, card parties, community theatre, church events. After we lost our home and moved to a rental across town, she stopped seeing friends entirely. She'd say she was too busy, but I'd find her sitting motionless by the window for hours. The woman, once the heart of our community, became nearly mute. This social withdrawal emerged as a common coping mechanism. Shame about downward mobility led many to isolate themselves rather than maintain relationships that reminded them of their losses. This isolation often compounded depression, creating cycles of emotional decline that remained unaddressed in an era when mental health care was primitive and stigmatized. For children, the psychological impacts manifested differently. Many developed extreme risk aversion and preoccupation with security that would influence their adult decisions decades later. School teachers reported students hoarding lunch leftovers and school supplies. Children as young as 6 began asking anxious questions about family finances. Clara Mortensen, who taught 3rd grade in Omaha, noted, "Before the Depression, children would trade sandwich halves or share treats. By 1932, I observed students carefully wrapping uneaten portions to take home. They'd count crayons repeatedly to ensure none were lost. These weren't behaviours their parents had directly taught them. The children were absorbing the anxiety from the atmosphere around them." What's particularly striking about Depression-era psychology was the disproportionate impact on men. In a culture that primarily defined masculine success through providership, unemployment profoundly impacted the core of male identity. Women, though certainly not immune to depression trauma, often had secondary identities as caregivers and home managers that remained intact despite financial collapse. Henry Gladwell, who spent 2 years riding the rails after losing his factory job in Akron, described this gender differential. A man without work in those days wasn't a man at all. Women could still be mothers and wives without paychecks. Women faced severe hardships, but their experiences were different from men's. For us men, unemployment wasn't just economic hardship, it was emasculation. Some fellows I knew would leave home each morning pretending to seek employment, but would actually spend the day in the public library just to maintain the fiction that they were still trying. This gendered experience created lasting imprints on family dynamics. Children who watched fathers struggle with identity loss often developed complex relationships with authority and achievement. Many Depression-era children grew up to become workaholics, driving themselves relentlessly to avoid the vulnerability they had witnessed in their parents. The psychological impact extended to how people viewed institutions. Trust in banks, corporations, and government suffered damage that would never fully heal. For many who had believed in American capitalism as an essentially fair system that rewarded hard work, the Depression destroyed this foundational assumption. "My father was a true believer in the American dream," explained Catherine Oakes, whose family lost their Michigan farm to foreclosure. He'd immigrated from Poland, worked 18 hours a day, and saved every penny. When the bank took our farm, something broke in him. Not just sadness. His entire worldview collapsed. He'd believed there was a moral order where virtue was rewarded. After that, he viewed all institutions with suspicion. He wouldn't even trust the post office with packages. This institutional distrust manifested in behaviours that outsiders often found incomprehensible. People who had survived bank failures might divide their modest savings between multiple hiding places. Important documents were kept at home rather than in safe deposit boxes. Government assistance programs were viewed with suspicion, even by those who desperately needed help. Perhaps most profoundly, the Depression altered America's relationship with possibility itself. The assumption that tomorrow would likely be better than today, a quintessentially American outlook, was replaced for many by a persistent expectation of calamity. This anticipatory anxiety became so ingrained that many Depression survivors maintained emergency preparations throughout their lives, long after economic recovery. Grandmother kept a suitcase packed until the day she died in 1992, recalled Tom Whitaker about his grandmother, who had lived through bank runs in 1931. She insisted every family member memorize a meeting location if things fell apart again. She maintained a pantry that could feed 20 people for months. When we cleaned out her apartment, we found gold coins sewn into the lining of her winter coat. The Depression never ended in her mind. When we examine the Depression beyond economic statistics, we discover how profoundly it transformed everyday routines and practices. Necessity forced innovation in ways that fundamentally reshaped American domestic life. Perhaps the most remarkable transformation happened in kitchens across America. Cooking practices that had been trending toward convenience foods in the 1920s reversed dramatically. Women who had never baked bread found themselves studying their grandmother's recipes. Complex systems for food preservation emerged in urban apartments never designed for such activities. Evelyn Carruthers, who managed a household in Baltimore, described this culinary revolution. Before 29, I bought baker's bread and canned vegetables without thinking. After my husband's pay was cut by 2/3, I had to relearn everything. I converted our fire escape into a cooling rack for bread. I learned to make 5 different meals from a single chicken. Nothing was wasted. Potato peels became soup stock, and meat bones were boiled repeatedly. We strained the bacon grease and used it for cooking throughout the week. This culinary transformation wasn't merely about frugality. It represented a fundamental change in how Americans related to their food. The direct involvement in food production created new relationships with ingredients and nutrition. Despite financial hardship, many Depression survivors reported that their diets improved in quality as they replaced processed foods with scratch cooking. Home maintenance underwent similar reinvention. The service economy that had begun emerging in the 1920s collapsed as families could no longer afford repairmen, cleaners, or delivery services. This scenario necessitated a massive reskilling of the American population, particularly among middle-class men who had specialized professionally but now needed to become generalists. Robert Thornhill, who had worked as an accountant in Chicago, exemplified this transition. Before the crash, I called professionals for everything: electricians, plumbers, carpenters. After losing my position, I couldn't afford 15 cents for a streetcar fare, let alone dollars for repairs. I traded accounting help to a hardware store owner for tools and manuals. I rewired our lighting, fixed the toilet, and rebuilt our kitchen table. My father had been a farmer who could fix anything, skills I'd dismissed as unnecessary in modern times. The Depression brought me back to his world with humility. This reskilling extended beyond maintenance to a complete reimagining of household objects. Americans developed ingenious systems for repurposing items that would otherwise be discarded. Flour sacks became dresses, car tires became shoe soles, newspapers became insulation, and cardboard was transformed into furniture reinforcement. Martha Simmons, who grew up in Tulsa, recalled her mother's ingenuity. Mum turned old wool coats into children's clothing. She unravelled worn-out sweaters to reknit the yarn into socks. But her most extraordinary creation was our new living room set. She couldn't afford upholstery. She needed fabric, so she gathered burlap coffee sacks from local shops, dyed them with walnut husks to achieve a consistent colour, and refinished our worn-out furniture. She stuffed the cushions with unravelled cotton from worn-out mattresses. Guests complimented our rustic decor, never realising it was born of desperation. Transportation underwent perhaps the most visible transformation. The automobile, which had become central to American identity in the 1920s, was now often unaffordable to operate. Families who kept their cars developed elaborate systems to extend their utility, adding cargo platforms to carry goods, converting sedans into pickup trucks by removing rear sections, and modifying engines to burn lower quality fuels. Many families returned to pre-automotive transportation. Urban bicycle usage surged. Alan Parker, who delivered groceries in Philadelphia, noted, "By 1932 the streets had changed completely. For weeks at a time people parked their cars up on blocks to reduce tyre wear. Meanwhile, bicycles were everywhere, often carrying entire families. I saw a father pedalling with his wife on the handlebars and 2 children on the back fender. People rigged incredible trailers to bikes for moving larger items. Leisure activities were similarly reinvented. Commercial entertainment, movies, nightclubs, and sports events became unaffordable luxuries for many. In response, Americans rediscovered participatory entertainment. Community singing, amateur theatricals, and storytelling circles experienced unexpected revivals. Board games enjoyed unprecedented popularity, with families often making their own versions of commercial games. The Depression also forced reconsideration of living arrangements. Extended families consolidated into shared housing, creating new intergenerational dynamics. In urban areas, apartment sharing became common among unrelated adults, creating ad hoc family structures that pooled resources and distributed household labor. Margaret Wilson, who shared a Chicago apartment with 5 other women, described these arrangements. "We each contributed what we could. Helen worked part-time as a secretary and provided most of our cash income. With my sewing machine still in working order, I made clothes for everyone. Dorothy had trained as a nurse and handled medical needs. We developed a system as precise as any factory, schedules for cooking, cleaning, and job hunting. We weren't relatives, but necessity made us closer than many families." Perhaps most significant was the transformation of time itself. The standardized workday, which had been increasingly normalized in the 1920s, disintegrated for many Americans. Work, when available, might come at any hour. The unemployed developed elaborate routines to provide structure to days no longer defined by workplace schedules. William Harrington, laid off from Pittsburgh's steel mills, described this temporal shift. "After 3 months without work, I realized time was becoming my enemy. Empty hours bred despair. So I created a schedule as rigid as the mills. Up at 5:30, breakfast, job hunting until noon. Afternoons for repair work or gardening. I dedicate my evenings to reading in order to enhance my skills. On Sundays, I dedicate myself to church and spending time with my family. It wasn't about efficiency. It was about maintaining sanity when the clock no longer ruled my life." This reinvention of daily routines wasn't merely adaptation. It represented a profound cultural shift in how Americans related to material goods, services, and time itself. The Depression forced a nationwide reassessment of needs versus wants, durability versus disposability, and self-reliance versus specialization. These values would influence consumption patterns and domestic practices for decades after economic recovery. The Depression is famous for individual hardships, but its most impressive story may be how communities devised survival strategies that changed American social organization. Together, these responses provided resilience where individual efforts failed. Highly sophisticated neighborhood support systems arose. Informal communication networks convey information about jobs, assistance programs, and local credit providers in metropolitan areas. These networks spanned ethnic and religious divides by using tenement hallways, laundry lines, and front stoops to spread information. Before the crash, the Jewish families in our building barely spoke to the Italian families 2 floors down, said Williamsburg resident Sarah Goldstein. Mrs. Esposito and my mother ran a soup pot for both families in 1931. After learning about the warehouse job, Mr. Esposito informed my father. Old boundaries fell because survival demanded cooperation. Mrs. Esposito lit candles with us on Friday nights because we were family, not because she was Jewish. Community cohesion led to practical assistance systems. Organic childcare cooperatives let parents switch job hunting days. Tool libraries let neighbours share expensive gear. Urban vacant sites become fertile land with communal gardens. The Depression also saw formal mutual help organisations grow. Many histories focus on government relief programmes, although community-based structures delivered faster and more culturally relevant aid. Religious, fraternal and ethnic benefit societies extended their roles to meet economic requirements. The black fraternal group Prince Hall Masons exhibited this expansion. Detroit Lodge officer Thomas Washington said, "Our organisation traditionally provides burial benefits and social connections. We became a job office, food distribution centre and housing referral agency overnight during the Depression. Every working brother supported the unemployed. When the economy failed, our community retained dignity." Labour unions expanded beyond workplace activism to provide overall support. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union in New York sponsored health clinics, cooperative housing, and adult education. Michigan United Auto Workers Unemployment Councils organised direct action to avoid evictions. Later UAW leader Walter Reuther remembered early Depression-era activities. Hundreds of workers blocked the sheriff when a family received an eviction notice. Then we'd negotiate lower rent or payment schedules with the landlord. We'd return the family's possessions after authorities left if eviction was inevitable. Now we fought for community survival, not pay. Rural communities established unique mutual help systems. Besides advocacy, the Grange coordinated seed exchanges, equipment sharing and labour pooling. Farmers formed communal lending circles based on European and African customs when bank failures devastated the conventional credit system. Transformations were especially profound in churches. Religion became aid distribution, employment and housing coordinators in addition to spiritual assistance. When public education funds fell, church basements became schools. Religious communities that had focused on spirituality now addressed material concerns directly. Before the Depression, charity was a minor part of our ministry, said Dayton, First Methodist Church pastor Michael Thompson. We turned our refuge into a nighttime dormitory by 1932. Our Sunday school classes became healthcare clinics with volunteer nurses. We broadened Christian responsibility from spirits to bodies. Theological consequences were huge. We couldn't preach about paradise while neglecting earthly misery. The cross-cutting aspect of these community systems was significant. Organisations that serviced ethnic, religious or occupational groups expanded their reach. The result opened up social relationships across boundaries. Intentional communities planned cooperative living arrangements that pooled resources to foster security grew during the Depression. These included official ventures like West Virginia's Arthurdale community, and spontaneous settlements like unemployed workers' cooperative camps outside major towns. According to Joseph Collins, who founded a cooperative camp outside Seattle, 60 families erected shelters from salvaged materials on vacant ground. We had sanitation, education, and food production committees like a little town. Everyone contributed skills. A fired teacher taught kids. Restaurant veterans ran our shared kitchen. We printed labour-backed script. It was more than survival. We were developing an alternative to the failed economy. These villages were social and economic innovation labs. Many tried cooperative ownership, labour exchange, and non-monetary economies to replace capitalism. Most of these attempts were absorbed into mainstream economic institutions, but they shaped American community organization. Community structures generated psychological resilience that individuals couldn't, most notably. Mutual aid participants had lower depression and suicide rates than those who struggled alone. Community responses brought meaning to suffering that may have seemed useless. Chicago settlement house worker Margaret Wilson said, "Community connections kept spirits alive. A huge psychological difference existed between unemployed men who joined our workers' council and those who stayed alienated. Meaning and perseverance came from shared hardship. The council members endured hunger and pain with friends, not shamefully alone. These collective survival structures challenged American individualism greatly. They showed that interdependence, not self-reliance, determined economic disaster survivability. Long after the Depression, this lesson shaped social policy and community organizing. The Great Depression affected almost all Americans, although some events are forgotten. Black Americans suffered greatly during the Depression, but conventional narratives rarely mention it. Already discriminated against in work, housing and education, black communities saw the Depression as a worsening of their poverty. Atlanta domestic worker Lillian Thompson characterized this continuity. Whites discussed the Depression like it ended the world. Historically, colored people were economically insecure. Last hired, first dismissed was our norm. We lost even our minimal security. My spouse and I saved $400 for a house. When Citizens Trust Bank failed, that money vanished. No government officials worried about black banks like they did white ones. Black agricultural workers suffered most in rural areas. In addition to chronic debt from sharecropping, they faced falling cotton prices and agricultural mechanization. Mechanical cotton pickers eliminated thousands of jobs in the 1930s when alternatives were scarce. This agricultural displacement spurred the great migration of black Americans to northern cities. The housing discrimination forced them into overcrowded, poor dwellings. Many New Deal initiatives helped Americans find housing, but redlining excluded black neighborhoods. Indigenous populations experienced the Depression through a complicated mix of economic breakdown and colonial policy. The failure of the cash economy had less of an impact on traditional subsistence tribes than on non-natives. Those forced into wage labor by previous government legislation were especially vulnerable. Joseph Blackhawk, an Omaha tribal member who worked in Nebraska meatpacking facilities, said, "Government schools and reservation regulations destroyed our grandparents' land-based abilities." Many of us relied on wage work that disappeared during the Depression. The transformation of our hunting grounds into farms and our plant-gathering sites into paved areas prevented us from reverting to our ancient customs. The simultaneous failure of both systems put us between worlds. The 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, despite its promotion as a progressive reform, resulted in increased economic dependency during the Depression. Constitutions that prioritize resource exploitation have reformed tribes, promoting outside interests over indigenous communities. Mexican Americans in the Southwest had particular Depression problems. Large producers slashed wages drastically, but still demanded hard work when crop prices plummeted. Mexican and Mexican-American workers faced violent suppression and deportation due to their organizing efforts. The federal government's repatriation plans demonstrate economic distress and racial targeting. About 60% of the 1 to 2 million Mexican Americans deported or pushed to leave the US between 1929 and 1936 were US citizens. The result was one of the largest forced migrations in American history, frequently without legal procedure. Elena Ramirez, whose family was deported to Mexico in 1932, said, "Immigration agents encircled our Los Angeles neighborhood and loaded everyone onto trucks. The fact that my brother and I were born in California and held American citizenship did not matter. We only had a few hours to pack. My father worked at the same factory for 9 years. Our church, school, and friends vanished overnight. We landed in Mexico as strangers. 20 years after my parents departed, we were considered pochos, neither Mexican nor American." Urban Americans rarely saw the hardship of rural white populations in Appalachia and the Ozarks. Economic deterioration in these areas began before 1929 owing to resource extraction and changing agricultural markets. The Depression sank economically marginalized groups into deep poverty. These regions emphasized the difference between deserving and undeserving poor. New Deal initiatives favored recent middle-class dropouts over multi-generational poor. Such multi-tiered assistance schemes occasionally excluded the most desperate. Disability during depression is another underestimated pain factor. Family support systems and philanthropic institutions crumbled, putting Americans with disabilities in unparalleled hardship. When demand for disabled American services expanded, financial cuts deteriorated their facilities. The Massachusetts State Psychiatric Hospital's Dr. Margaret Chen observed this decline. We were understaffed and underfunded before the crash. After state budgets fell, circumstances were terrible. Our patient base increased while staff shrank by a third. Food quality plummeted, treatment became confinement. We ran out of resources during acute illness. So many individuals who could have recovered were institutionalized for life. Depression devastated carefully developed support systems for physically challenged Americans living freely. When informal helpers focused on their own survival, disabled people who had retained autonomy through community networks were forced into institutionalization. The Depression produced new disability categories. Childhood malnutrition caused lifelong developmental problems. Safety requirements were abandoned to minimize costs, increasing workplace accidents. Depression-related psychological trauma caused untreated mental health issues. How economic disaster affected youth is often forgotten in depression accounts. Schools in various locations cut academic years or shuttered due to budget limitations. Child labour, which had been falling for decades, rose as families required cash from everyone. Malnutrition at key development had lifelong physical and cognitive damage. Helen Morrison, a rural Kentucky teacher, saw these changes. Planting and harvest attendance was intermittent before the catastrophe. Many children vanished by 1932. I found them working full-time at anything they could find when I visited their homes. Some families had broken up, with children living with relatives or neighbours, while parents looked for jobs. Many of my students lost the idea of infancy as a protected period of development. These forgotten depression scenes show how economic disaster deepened social divisions. While popular narratives highlight shared pain that linked Americans, these forgotten tales show how crises reinforced race, region, aptitude, and age hierarchies. The Great Depression created enduring legacies that shaped American society for generations in ways few could have predicted. These influences transformed behaviors and attitudes that would persist long after economic recovery. The most visible legacy was Americans' relationship with financial risk. Depression survivors developed what marketers later called depression syndrome, financial behaviors that prioritize security over opportunity, even when economically irrational. Millionaires who had survived bank failures maintained multiple modest accounts rather than consolidated ones. Successful professionals refused mortgages despite having ample income. Families stockpiled necessities due to concerns about future shortages. Dorothy Klein, a consumer researcher in the 1950s, noted that conventional advertising could not persuade depression survivors. They evaluated purchases through a trauma lens. I interviewed a doctor who kept 25 pounds of coffee in his pantry. When coffee was rationed during the war, he'd developed anxiety about shortages. 20 years later, despite abundant supplies, he maintained this buffer against a threat that no longer existed. This security-oriented mindset was passed down to children raised by depression survivors. The silent generation and early baby boomers inherited their parents' risk aversion, despite growing up in unprecedented prosperity. This generational transmission of financial trauma influenced banking, housing, and retail sectors for decades, as these sectors unknowingly catered to customers whose decision-making was influenced by psychological patterns formed during the 1930s. The Depression fundamentally altered Americans' relationship with government. Before 1929, most citizens had minimal interaction with federal agencies. By 1940, government had become an everyday presence through relief programs, employment projects, and regulatory frameworks. This created expectations that transcended traditional political divisions. Frank Holloway, who administered WPA projects in Tennessee, noted, "Before the Depression, mentioning I worked for the federal government drew suspicion. By 1936, people welcomed me because I represented jobs and assistance. People who philosophically opposed government interference now expect government solutions. This evolution wasn't about liberal or conservative, it was about a fundamental recalibration of what government was for. Cultural expressions underwent profound transformation. The arts developed dual impulses that seemed contradictory, but often existed within the same works. Unflinching documentation of suffering alongside escapist entertainment. The documentary tradition emerged in photography, Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, and literature, Steinbeck, Wright, while escapism flourished in Hollywood musicals and superhero comics. Playwright Arthur Miller explained this duality. The theatre swung between agitprop realism and pure fantasy. What endured were works that somehow managed both, acknowledging suffering while suggesting transcendence. Audiences needed both truth and hope, reality and possibility. The Depression created a generation that approached community building with deliberate intention. Having experienced how economic disaster could isolate individuals, many survivors became what sociologists later called intentional neighbours, deliberately cultivating community connections as insurance against future hardship. The explosion of civic organizations in post-Depression America, from PTAs to neighborhood associations, reflected this impulse. While often viewed as expressions of 1950s conformity, these organizations actually represented lessons learned from 1930s isolation. Perhaps most profound was the Depression's impact on Americans' relationship with work itself. Employment became more than an economic necessity. It became psychological validation. The experience of involuntary joblessness created lasting associations between work and identity that influenced retirement patterns for decades. To Samuel Weinstein, who studied aging in the 1970s, found, Depression survivors approached retirement differently than subsequent generations. They often couldn't articulate why continued work felt essential. One successful businessman told me, "I know I don't need the money, but I need to be needed." Their concern wasn't about income, but about avoiding the psychological state of uselessness they had experienced during unemployment decades earlier. Looking back, many aspects of American life we take for granted, from Social Security to bank deposit insurance, emerged directly from Depression experiences. These institutional responses to catastrophe became so normalized that their origins and crisis were forgotten, their existence seemingly natural rather than a response to specific historical trauma. What remains most remarkable about the Depression's legacy is how it demonstrated both human vulnerability and resilience simultaneously. It revealed how quickly prosperity could vanish and how fragile social structures could prove. Yet it also showed how communities could adapt and societies could reimagine themselves in response to catastrophe. As Depression survivor Eleanor Winthrop reflected, what stayed with me wasn't the hardship itself, but the discovery of what humans could withstand and create from ruins. We lost our innocence about economic security, but gained wisdom about human connection. The disappearance of the money did not diminish the value of the ingenious adaptations, extraordinary kindnesses, and communities forged in struggle that replaced it. The paradox of catastrophe is that it takes with one hand but gives with the other, and sometimes the gifts outlast the losses. In the year 1162, amidst the sweeping steppes of Mongolia, a child was born into a world of cold winds and endless plains. This child, named Temujin, would grow to become the great Genghis Khan, a name that would echo across history as the founder of the Mongol Empire. But before he became a conqueror, he was simply a boy born into struggle, shaped by the harshness of his environment and the conflicts of his people. The Mongolian steppes stretched far and wide, a vast expanse of grasslands where the sky met the earth in a seamless horizon. Life here was simple yet brutal. Nomadic tribes moved with their herds, living off the land and surviving the harsh winters and the scorching summers. It was a world where strength, loyalty, and resilience were the keys to survival. Temujin's early years were marked by hardship. He was the son of Yesugei, a minor tribal leader, and his wife Holun. When Temujin was just a young boy, his father was poisoned by a rival tribe. This sudden loss left his family vulnerable, and they were abandoned by their own clan. His mother, Hulun, took on the responsibility of raising Temujin and his siblings alone. The family was left to fend for themselves on the open steppes, relying on foraging, hunting, and sheer determination to survive. These early struggles forged a deep resilience in Temujin. He learned to endure hunger, cold, and the constant threat of violence. But he also learned the value of unity, the importance of family, and the need for loyalty. His mother's strength became a guiding force in his life. She taught him that survival required not only physical strength, but also wisdom, patience, and an unyielding spirit. As Temujin grew older, he began to understand the fragmented world of the Mongol tribes. There were endless feuds, shifting alliances, and a constant struggle for power. He saw how disunity left his people vulnerable. He dreamed of something greater, of a world where the tribes could be united, where the endless conflicts could be replaced with a shared purpose. But before he could realize this vision, he faced countless challenges. Betrayal was a constant threat. One of his closest friends, Jamuka, who had once sworn brotherhood with him, would later become his rival. Temujin's path was marked by moments of capture, imprisonment, and escape. Each setback hardened his resolve. He believed that strength was found not just in the sword, but in the unity of purpose and loyalty. In time, Temujin began to gather followers who saw his vision. He was not just a warrior. He was a leader who understood people. He rewarded loyalty and merit rather than noble birth, a revolutionary idea in a world bound by tradition. His reputation grew, and more tribes pledged their allegiance to him. His ability to inspire, to strategize, and to adapt set him apart. He was relentless, determined, and focused on a single goal: to unite the Mongol tribes under one banner. In 1206, after years of battles, alliances, and strategic brilliance, Temujin achieved his dream. He was declared Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. It was a title that reflected his role as the unifier of the Mongols, a leader who'd brought together the once fractured tribes into a formidable force. But Genghis Khan's vision did not stop at the borders of Mongolia. He saw beyond the steppes, beyond the horizon. His ambition was to create a world where his people could thrive, where the divisions that had weakened them for centuries could be replaced by a new order. His armies, skilled horsemen and fierce warriors, began to expand the Mongol territory. They moved with speed, discipline, and precision, conquering lands that had once seemed unreachable. The campaigns of Genghis Khan swept across Central Asia, into China, and beyond. His leadership was marked by a combination of ruthless efficiency and strategic genius. He understood the importance of adapting to new challenges, incorporating new technologies, and learning from the cultures he encountered. Under his rule, the Mongol Empire became a melting pot of ideas, trade, and communication. But Genghis Khan was more than just a conqueror. He established laws to bring order to the chaos of his expanding empire. His code, known as the Yasa, emphasized loyalty, discipline, and justice. He promoted religious tolerance, recognizing that unity required respecting the beliefs of diverse peoples. He created systems of communication, trade routes, and infrastructure that connected distant parts of his empire. The Silk Road, once a dangerous route, flourished under Mongol protection, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures. As you breathe in deeply, picture the vast Mongolian steppes under a night sky filled with stars. The grass sways gently in the breeze, and the world is quiet except for the soft sounds of horses and the distant crackle of campfires. Genghis Khan's legacy stretches across these plains, a reminder of a leader who dared to dream of unity, who faced the harshness of his world with an unbreakable spirit. His life was a journey of resilience, vision, and transformation. He turned adversity into strength, chaos into order, and disunity into a vast and enduring empire. Though his methods were fierce, his impact on the world was profound. The connections he forged between East and West reshaped history, leaving a legacy that endures to this day. As you sink deeper into relaxation, let the story of Genghis Khan remind you of the power of perseverance, the strength found in unity, and the importance of vision. His life, filled with challenges and triumphs, speaks to the boundless potential within each of us, the ability to overcome, to lead, and to create lasting change. As you drift even deeper into the calming embrace of sleep, let the echoes of Genghis Khan's journey gently guide your thoughts. His story, one of struggle, vision, and unrelenting determination, is a reminder of the strength that lies within every challenge we face and the boundless potential we possess to shape our own destinies. Picture the endless Mongolian steppes beneath a vast night sky, where the stars shine like scattered diamonds, illuminating the dark plains below. The wind moves softly, whispering tales of ancient conquests and unification, carrying with it the faint scent of grasslands and distant fires. This is the world where Genghis Khan forged his legacy, a world where survival was harsh, but the spirit of resilience was even stronger. As his empire expanded, so too did his influence. His conquests stretched from the mountains of China to the deserts of Persia, from the plains of Russia to the cities of the Middle East. But beyond the battles and the victories, Genghis Khan's mind remained focused on a singular goal: creating a world where his people could thrive. He was not driven purely by conquest, but by the desire to establish order where there was once chaos, to bring unity to lands divided by endless feuds. The Mongol Empire under his leadership was not just vast but interconnected. Trade routes flourished under his protection, allowing merchants, scholars, and travellers to move more freely than ever before. This period of stability and security, often referred to as the Pax Mongolica, allowed ideas, cultures, and innovations to flow across continents. Paper, gunpowder, and art travelled from east to west, while philosophies, religions, and scientific discoveries spread in return. Imagine the caravans moving slowly across the Silk Road, their lanterns glowing softly in the dark, their footsteps measured and steady, the gentle clinking of goods, the murmur of languages blending together. This was a world where once isolated cultures began to connect, creating a tapestry of shared human experience. Genghis Khan's vision of an interconnected world laid the foundation for this exchange, bridging the gaps between civilizations and opening pathways that had once seemed impassable. As you breathe in slowly, picture the vast expanse of his empire, the land stretching beyond sight. Mountains rise in the distance, rivers carve paths through fertile valleys, and open plains roll endlessly toward the horizon. Each part of this landscape, once divided, is now united under a common rule, a testament to the power of a shared purpose. Genghis Khan's dream of unity has become a reality, one shaped by his unwavering will and strategic brilliance. But even as his empire grew, Genghis Khan remained tied to the simplicity of his roots. He lived a life close to the earth, surrounded by the people who had followed him from the very beginning. He never allowed himself to be consumed by luxury or excess. His strength lay in his ability to understand both the warrior's path and the leader's burden, to balance the ferocity of conquest with the wisdom of governance. As the years passed, Genghis Khan continued to guide his people, his vision extending beyond his own lifetime. He established systems of law and order, ensuring that justice and discipline held his empire together. His code, the Yasa, provided structure and fairness, holding even the highest-ranking leaders accountable. This commitment to order and loyalty became the backbone of the Mongol Empire, a legacy that would endure long after his death. In 1227, Genghis Khan's journey came to an end. He passed away during a military campaign. His body returned to the land he had known since childhood. His burial place remains a mystery, hidden somewhere in the vast steppes, a secret held tightly by those who revered him. But though his physical presence faded, his legacy continued to shape the world. His descendants carried his vision forward, expanding the empire and cementing his place in history. As you breathe deeply, feel the quiet power of Genghis Khan's story resonating within you. His life teaches us that, even in the face of unimaginable challenges, a determined spirit can overcome, a clear vision can unify, and resilience can shape the course of history. He transformed his hardships into strength, his struggles into purpose, and his dreams into reality. Imagine the steppes once more, now calm under the vast night sky. The stars continue their silent watch. The wind carries a sense of timelessness, and the land stretches out in quiet peace. The world rests much like you do now, embracing the stillness that follows the storm, the calm that comes after a journey well travelled. Allow yourself to let go completely, to surrender to this peaceful stillness. The story of Genghis Khan has taken you across endless plains, through battles, struggles, and victories. Now, you rest, knowing that strength, resilience, and vision lie within you, just as they did within him. The journey of discovery, growth, and purpose is yours to continue when you awaken. As you sink deeper into the embrace of sleep, let the echoes of Genghis Khan's legacy ripple through your mind like a soft, steady current. His journey was vast, stretching across endless plains and through the annals of history, yet his life was also a reflection of universal truths: strength in adversity, vision beyond boundaries, and the enduring power of unity. Imagine the stillness of the steppes at dawn, the first light of day casting a golden hue across the endless grasslands. The world holds its breath in quiet anticipation, a moment suspended between night and day. This is the same land that shaped Temujin, the boy who became Genghis Khan. The cold winds, the hardships, the endless horizons, all these elements forged his spirit, teaching him to endure, to adapt, and to lead. As you breathe deeply, let that same sense of quiet resilience settle within you. Just as the steppes stretched beyond sight, so too do the possibilities within your own life. The journey of Genghis Khan reminds us that no matter how vast the challenges before us, the human spirit is capable of incredible endurance and transformation. In your mind's eye, picture the endless caravans that travelled the Silk Road under the protection of the Mongol Empire. Merchants from distant lands move steadily along ancient routes, their carts loaded with silks, spices, and knowledge. The world is connected in ways it had never been before, ideas flowing freely across continents. These connections, once fragile and uncertain, now weave a tapestry of shared human experience. Genghis Khan's vision brought people together, creating pathways where there had once been barriers. His legacy lives not just in the conquests, but in the bridges he built between cultures, the systems of order he established, and the idea that unity, even amidst diversity, is possible. Now, let your thoughts drift further into the stillness of night. The campfires have burned down to embers, their soft glow casting faint light across the faces of warriors, nomads, and travellers. The air is filled with the faint scent of smoke and the quiet murmur of people at rest. This moment of peace, hard-earned and cherished, reflects the balance that Genghis Khan sought, a world where strength and stability allowed for moments of tranquility. Feel the calm spread through your body, each breath drawing you deeper into a space of comfort and safety. The struggles of the day fall away like grains of sand carried by the wind. You are part of a larger story, one where each challenge you face shapes you, where every moment of resilience adds to your strength. Like the great Khan, you possess the power to endure, to dream, and to create a legacy of your own. Imagine now the vast plain stretching out beneath a sky filled with stars. The universe seems infinite, yet there is a profound sense of peace in knowing that you are a part of this grand expanse. The wind whispers gently, carrying with it the stories of the past, the hopes of the present, and the dreams of the future. You're connected to this timeless flow, your spirit at ease, your heart steady. As your mind drifts further into sleep, let the essence of Genghis Khan's story remain with you. His life, shaped by hardship and triumph, reminds us that within every challenge lies an opportunity for growth. His journey from a boy abandoned on the steppes to a ruler who united vast lands is a testament to the power of determination and vision. You too carry that same potential within you, the ability to overcome, to rise, and to transform. The world outside grows softer now, the edges of reality blurring as you surrender to rest. Your breath is slow, steady, and calm. Each inhale fills you with a sense of possibility. Each exhale releases any tension you've been holding. The night wraps around you like a warm cloak, protecting and soothing you as you drift further into peaceful sleep. As you drift even deeper into the embrace of sleep, the vast plains of history stretch endlessly before you, serene and timeless. The gentle rhythm of your breath mirrors the calm, steady winds of the Mongolian steppes, whispering stories of courage, resilience, and transformation. The journey of Genghis Khan lingers softly in your mind, a reminder that every challenge faced, every hardship overcome, shapes the path towards something greater. In this peaceful expanse, the world feels limitless. The night sky, filled with an infinite sea of stars, reflects the boundless potential within you. Each star glimmers with a quiet brilliance, a beacon of possibility, hope, and the dreams that lie waiting beyond the horizon. Just as Genghis Khan dared to look beyond the confines of his world, you too are capable of breaking through barriers, of envisioning new paths, of creating a life defined by your own resilience and purpose. Imagine the quiet of the ancient world. No city lights, no noise of modern life, just the pure, unbroken silence of the night. The grass beneath you is soft, cool and fragrant. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of earth and distant fires. The only sounds are the faint rustling of the wind and the occasional soft nicker of a horse standing watch. This tranquility is a gift, a space where you can let go, breathe deeply, and allow your mind to float freely. As you inhale, draw in a sense of calm strength. With each exhale, release the burdens of the day, the worries that cling like shadows. In this space, there is no need to rush, no need to struggle. You are safe, held gently by the vastness of history and the quiet wisdom it offers. Like the open steppes, your mind expands, free from constraints, filled with possibility. The story of Genghis Khan is one of transformation, of a young boy who endured pain and loss, but who rose to become a leader who reshaped the world. His journey reminds us that strength is born in moments of adversity, that the spirit is forged in the fires of challenge. His vision was clear, his resolve unbreakable, and within you too lies that same seed of potential, that same capacity for growth, for vision, for resilience. Picture the endless plains bathed in the soft glow of dawn. The first rays of sunlight touch the horizon, casting a warm golden light over the land. The sky shifts from deep indigo to gentle hues of pink and orange. The world awakens slowly, peacefully, as the night gives way to a new day. This transition from darkness to light is a symbol of hope, a reminder that no matter how long the night may seem, the dawn always comes. Let this thought settle gently in your mind. Just as the night must yield to the morning, every struggle you face, every challenge you endure holds the promise of renewal, of new beginnings, of possibilities yet to be realized. The journey of life, like the journey of Genghis Khan, is one of cycles, of hardship and triumph, of darkness and light, of endings and new beginnings. Feel your body relax even further, each muscle letting go, your mind sinking deeper into the comfort of sleep. The weight of the world lifts away, leaving you light, free, and at peace. The winds of the steppes, The vast horizons and the quiet strength of history envelop you in a cocoon of serenity. In this state of deep relaxation, know that you are part of something timeless. The struggles, the victories, the dreams of those who came before you live on, whispering their wisdom and encouragement. You are connected to this greater tapestry of humanity, a thread woven through the fabric of time, resilient and unbroken.